Agnes pressed her palm flat against the iron gate and felt it breathe. Not the way the wind breathes, and not the way metal releases the stored warmth of a long afternoon in the sun. This was something deliberate and slow, a single, deep pulse that moved outward through the iron, the way a heartbeat moves through a chest wall. And when it reached Agnes's palm, it carried a cold that had absolutely no business existing in that place, at that time of the evening. The air around her was warm. The red earth beneath her bare feet was warm. The iron was not. It was cold in a way that felt stored, pressed inward, as if it had been held inside the metal for a very long time, and was only now being allowed to reach the surface. She kept her hand there. She counted to 3. She pulled her hand back. She looked at her palm in the fading light. Nothing showed on the skin. No mark, no color change. Nothing she could point to and say something happened here. But her hand was trembling in a way that had nothing to do with cold or exertion, and she pressed it flat against her hip to stop it. This was her evening walk. Every single evening for 31 years, without a single exception, she had walked from her house at the northern end of the village of Fairholme, along the red dirt path that ran past the grinding mill, past the well, past the church, and past the last cluster of houses, to the eastern edge of the village, where the path simply ended, and the gate began. In the dry season, the walk took about 11 minutes. In the rainy season, when the laterite earth turned to thick red mud and clung to the soles of her shoes, it could take close to 20. She had made this walk in blazing midday sun. She had made it in driving rain, in pitch dark, in the suffocating heat of mid-July when the air sat on the village like something heavy and wet. She had made it while running a fever. She had made it the morning after Henry died, with her hands still shaking from having touched his face and found it cold. She had not missed a single evening in 31 years. The gate was not a thing that impressed you when you first saw it. It was 4 feet wide and just under 5 feet tall. It was made of 12 iron bars running vertically, connected by 2 horizontal bars, one across the top and one across the middle. The bars were dark and rough with decades of surface rust, the kind of rust that looked as though it should have eaten through the metal long ago but somehow had not, because the bars were as solid and unmovable as the day they were set. On the right side wooden post, a simple bent iron latch held the gate closed. No lock, no chain, just the latch. The gate was set between 2 upright posts, driven into the red earth, so long ago that the wood had hardened to the color of coal. Whatever those posts had once been, they were something tougher now. And on either side of the gate, there was no wall, no fence, nothing at all. It stood alone at the point where Fairholme ended, and the flat, unmarked red ground beyond it began, ground that no one farmed, no one built on, no one walked across for any reason. Travelers who passed through occasionally noticed the gate and asked about it. They received answers that were true but incomplete. It was very old. It marked the eastern boundary of the village. It was important. Most people who received those answers could sense there was more, and chose not to press, because they felt, even without knowing why, that the more to it was something serious. The people of Fairholme believed, without drama or ceremony, that the gate was a real door. Not symbolic, not poetic, a literal threshold between the world of the living and whatever lay on the other side. They did not use frightening language about it. What they said about the world beyond the gate was simple. It was where the people of Fairholme went when they died. It existed. It was close. The gate was the only thing between that world and this one, and the gate was meant to stay closed, and it had always stayed closed. And the reason it had always stayed closed was that there had always been a gatekeeper to close it. Agnes was the 6th gatekeeper in her line. She had not chosen the role. No gatekeeper ever chose. The role passed through the women of one family, through each generation, and whether you welcomed it or not when it arrived, you took it, because the alternative was to refuse it, and no woman in Agnes's line had ever refused it. There was no one else who could do this particular thing. You did not walk away from something only you could do. Agnes's mother, Edith, had been the 5th gatekeeper. Edith had been a tall, quiet woman, with a habit of looking at things slightly longer than most people thought necessary, as if she were waiting for the thing she was looking at to say something. She had brought Agnes to the gate for the first time when Agnes was 8 years old, placed Agnes's small hands on the iron, and said, "Do you feel that?" Agnes had felt the gate's attention. Not warmth, not energy, not anything with a scientific name. Attention. The sense that something on the other side was aware that her hands were there, and was deciding what to think about them. She had said yes. Edith had nodded once, and taken Agnes's hands away, and walked them both back to the village without another word. That was the beginning. Agnes became gatekeeper, in fact, at 32, on a Tuesday morning with rain approaching. Edith had walked with her to the gate one last time, placed Agnes's hands on the iron, and held them there. "It knows you now," Edith had said. "You are the one it will answer to. It will tell you things. Learn to listen." 3 months after that morning, Edith had died quietly in her own bed, in the middle of a night in June, without any warning. Agnes had always believed that her mother had simply been waiting until the gate was safely handed on, before she allowed herself to rest. Agnes had been married for 14 years by then. Her husband Henry was a farmer, steady, quiet, not given to long speeches about anything, with a habit of humming tunelessly to himself while he worked that Agnes had found, over years, to be one of the most comforting sounds she knew. He had never made her feel that the gate was a strange thing to be responsible for. He had never pressed her for explanations she could not give. "You do your work," he had told her once. "I do mine. That is how things stay right." Henry had died 11 years ago, in the night, without any suffering Agnes could detect. She had touched his face in the morning, and found it cold and completely still, and she had sat with her hands on his face for a long time, before she went to call for anyone. Before Henry died, before Edith died, there had been William. Agnes and Henry's son had lived 4 days. He had been born healthy. She was sure of it. She was a midwife, who had delivered more children than she could count. And she had known her own son was healthy. And then on the 4th night, a fever had taken him so quickly that there had been no time to understand what was happening before it was over. Agnes had not spoken for 2 weeks after that. Henry had sat beside her every evening through those 2 weeks, and said nothing, because he understood that the only thing to do in the presence of grief that large was to stay and wait. She had no daughters. She had no children at all now. This was the weight that accompanied every evening walk. After her, the gatekeeper role required someone who had the quality. Her mother had recognized it in Agnes at 8 years old. Agnes had been looking carefully in the young women of Fairholme for several years. She had not found it yet. The Chief Walter had asked her 3 weeks ago over tea whether there was someone coming after her. She had told him not yet. He had nodded the way very old men nod when they receive the answer they expected and did not want. Agnes was 63 and in good health, but she was not going to be 63 forever. The village of Fairholme had been established about 120 years ago, according to the oldest records anyone had found. It was not large, 83 families, living in mud and concrete houses connected by paths worn smooth by generations of feet. There was a well at the center of the main path, a church with a corrugated iron roof, a 4-room school, a market that ran 3 mornings a week, and a grinding mill at the southern end. The chief was Walter, 70 years old, white-haired, deliberate in everything. The pastor was Leonard, who had come to Fairholme 26 years ago, and had long since adapted his understanding of the spirit world to include things his formal training had not prepared him for. The oldest village elder was Arthur, 68, who had known Agnes's mother in her prime, and who kept the village's oral history with the seriousness of someone who understood that oral history was not lesser than written history, but different only in how it was held. In the past 7 days, 3 things had happened that Agnes had not told anyone about. First, the goats belonging to a man named Frank had stopped going east. Frank kept his animals on the eastern side of the village, where the best grazing was, but for 6 days now they had refused to cross a point about 200 meters from the gate. They stopped, turned, and went another direction. Frank had checked them for illness. They were completely healthy. He had mentioned it as a curiosity. Agnes had heard about it through her neighbor Clara, and said nothing. Second, on 2 separate evenings in the past 5 days, Agnes had smelled something at the gate that did not belong there. A thin metallic smell, like old copper, mixed with something mineral and damp, like the inside of an old well. It appeared when she came within 10 feet of the gate, and disappeared when she stepped back. There was no natural explanation for it. Third, 4 days ago, 3 children in Fairholme had fallen ill within the same 24 hours. Oliver was 7, the son of a woman named Nora. May was 5, the granddaughter of Grace, an older woman who kept the grinding mill. And Rose was barely 3, daughter of a couple named Arnold and Mabel. All 3 children had developed low fevers, a persistent tiredness that no rest seemed to lift, and a habit of staring past people when spoken to, as if listening to something in a direction no one else could locate. It was that last thing, that listening quality in their eyes, that had frightened the mothers most. Nora had taken Oliver to the clinic 14 miles away. The clinic found nothing wrong and sent him home. Agnes had visited each child. She had looked carefully at their eyes. She had placed her hand on each small forehead. She had not said what she was thinking to any of the mothers. She had come home and stood in the dark of her house for a long time before she moved. She had known all week, with a quiet certainty that carried no drama, that the gate was involved. She had kept this knowledge still inside herself, waiting to understand the exact shape of what was coming, before she told anyone, because telling people before she understood would only create fear, and fear was the most useless thing she knew of when something real needed to be dealt with. But tonight, standing 2 steps from the gate, in the gathering dark with the memory of that cold pulse still in her palm, Agnes understood that the time for waiting was finished. Her mother's voice came back to her from 31 years ago. When you feel it breathe, you do not leave. You stay. She had felt it breathe. She was staying. She looked back at the village one last time. Lights were going on in windows. Wood smoke was rising. The radio from a house near the mill was playing something she did not recognize. Everything looked peaceful and ordinary, and completely unaware of what was happening at its eastern edge. She turned back toward the gate. She had covered about half the remaining distance when she heard it. Not the full groan of iron shifting, that would come later. Something smaller and far more precise. A thin, definite rattle from the latch, coming from the inside, like a single finger tapping against the inside of a closed door. Once, then silence. Agnes stopped where she was. She stood completely still, and breathed in slowly through her nose, held it for 2 counts, let it out through her mouth. She did this 3 times, until the trembling in her hands eased. Then she walked to the gate. She covered the remaining distance in steady, unhurried strides, and when she reached the iron, she placed both palms flat against it, without hesitation and without ceremony. The cold came up to meet her immediately, pressing hard against her palms with something that felt like intention, not temperature alone, but weight with a direction. Agnes pressed back. She found her footing on the red earth, adjusted the angle of her arms, pressed every part of her palms evenly against the bars, and leaned her body forward the way her mother had taught her, not fighting the gate, but making clear to whatever was pressing from the other side that this door was not going to open. She spoke the old words her mother had given her, quietly and clearly, the way one states a fact to something that understands facts. Then she was quiet. The iron pressed back. She pressed harder. She could not have known, standing alone in the full dark with the sounds of the village fading behind her, that she would not move from that spot for 72 hours. She could not have known about the morning coming, or what the second night would cost her, or what she would hear herself say in the deepest hour of the 3rd day. She knew only what 6 generations of women before her had known. While her hands were on the gate, it would not open. She held on. Before she left the house that evening, she had stood for a moment at her door. The sky was still light enough to see the path clearly. The air smelled of red earth and wood smoke and something else. Something that had no name she could give it comfortably. She had stood there with her hand on the doorframe, and she had breathed it in, and she had thought, tonight is different. She had thought this about many evenings over 31 years, and on most of those evenings she had been wrong, in the particular way that careful people are wrong, not because they are careless, but because they are watching so closely that they sometimes see warning in the ordinary. But her mother had told her, you will know the difference eventually. It is not a loud difference. It is the kind that asks you to pay attention. She was paying attention now. She was always paying attention. That was the nature of the role. A gatekeeper was not someone who worked a shift and then went home and forgot about the work until the next shift. The work was continuous, woven through everything else she did. When she was in the garden, a part of her was at the gate. When she was delivering a baby in someone else's house at 3 in the morning, a part of her was at the gate. When she sat in the evening and ate her meal and watched the chickens through the window, a part of her was at the gate. This was not burden exactly. It had been burden in the first years, before she understood it. Now it was simply how she was built. The gate was part of the architecture of herself. The first hour was the quietest. Agnes stood in the dark with her palms flat against the iron, and her feet planted on the earth, and her eyes open, and she did what she had been trained to do in those early hours. She made herself very still inside. Not just in body but in thought, because her mother had told her that a gatekeeper who panicked was a gatekeeper who lost ground. "The gate responds to you," Edith had said more than once, with the patience of someone who understood that some lessons had to be repeated until they were held in the bones, and not just the mind. "Whatever you bring to your hands, you bring to the gate. Bring panic, and the gate will feel it. Bring steadiness, and the gate will feel that too. You are not separate from it in those moments. You are part of the same thing." Agnes brought steadiness, or as close to steadiness as she could manage, with the cold pressing through her palms, and the memory of the latch rattling from the inside still sharp in the back of her mind. The village sounds faded fully within the first 30 minutes. There was no moon yet, and the stars above were very bright, and very unhelpful in terms of visible light. The red earth path behind her disappeared into dark. The gate itself was barely visible, a slightly darker rectangle against the darkness, its iron bars picked out by starlight in thin, dull lines. Agnes did not need to see it. She could feel it completely through her hands, the way a person who has spent years reading something learns to read it through touch and memory rather than sight. She knew the temperature of each bar, the subtle variation in texture where the rust was heaviest, the slight thickening of the iron at the joint where the lower horizontal bar met the post. She had been reading this gate with her hands for 31 years. She knew it the way she knew her own face in the dark. She thought about her mother. Edith had described the gate's history to Agnes over many years, a piece at a time, the way the oral tradition had always worked. Not in one long formal telling, but in fragments offered at the right moments, so that by the time Agnes had received all of it, she understood not only what she had been given, but why each piece had been offered when it was. The gate's history, as Edith had learned it, and as that knowledge had been passed mother to daughter for 6 generations, was this. The gate had been set, built or placed or made. No one in the lineage was entirely certain which word was most accurate. At a time before the current village of Fairholme existed, there had been an older settlement at this location. What it was called and precisely how long it had stood before Fairholme replaced it had not been recorded anywhere anyone found, but the gate had been there when the current settlement was being established, and whoever had lived there before had left clear instructions about what the gate was and what it required. What it required was a keeper, always a woman, always of this line. Why specifically this family and not another? Agnes's mother had told her honestly she did not fully know. Some things in the tradition are not explained, Edith had said. They are only passed on. Maybe the explanation was lost somewhere back along the line. Maybe the people who made this arrangement did not feel it needed explaining. Maybe they believed the reason was obvious to anyone paying attention. Agnes had asked what the obvious reason might be. Edith had looked at her for a long, composed moment, and said, "Women have been closing doors since the beginning of time, not because they are told to, because they understand what happens if the door is left open." Agnes had been in her early 20s when she first heard those words. They had settled into her and stayed. The cold in the gate had not changed in the first hour. It held at the same steady level, pressing outward, and Agnes pressed back steadily, and the two things balanced each other in the dark without drama. This was what her mother had called the first phase, assessment. The gate is deciding, Edith had explained. It is learning whether what it feels in you is real, whether you are truly committed, or whether you will eventually step back. Do not give it any reason to think you will step back. Agnes had not stepped back. She would not step back. This was a fact as settled inside her as the red earth under her feet. She thought about the time 12 years ago when she had held the gate alone through a cold and windy night in November. She had been in her early 50s, still physically very strong, and the gate had pressed steadily for about 4 hours before the cold had finally begun to ease. She had come home just before dawn with raw palms and had made tea and sat alone in the dark for a long time before the sky had lightened enough for the birds to begin. She had never told anyone about that night. It had not occurred to her that she should. The gatekeeper's work was not something you reported. You did it. You came home. You kept going. Henry had come to the gate with her once, in the early years of her keeping. She had not invited him, but he had been awake late one evening, had seen her leave, and had followed, not to interfere, but because he was the kind of man who kept a quiet eye on the people he loved, without making a production of it. He had stayed back a respectful distance, when he understood where she was going, and what she was doing. She had known he was there from about halfway along the path. She recognized his particular footfall, The slightly heavier step on the left. She had not sent him away. When she finished her check that evening and turned to come home, he was sitting on the ground about 30 feet from the gate, patient and still in the dark. He stood when she came close and said nothing about what he had seen or felt. He simply walked back with her along the path, and once on the path, his hand brushed hers, and she let it rest there. And that had been enough. That had been more than enough. She missed him in moments like this one, not with the acute pain of fresh loss, which she had long since moved through, but with a quieter and more permanent awareness of his absence, in situations he would have understood without explanation. Around what she estimated to be midnight, she had no watch and had not brought a lamp, having left the house thinking she was going for her usual evening check. The cold in the gate changed for the first time. Not increased, but changed in quality, as if something on the other side had shifted its position or intention. Agnes felt it through her palms, as a very slight alteration in the direction of the pressure, tilting slightly upward, as if whatever was pressing was growing in the vertical direction, becoming taller or expanding upward. She adjusted her hands slightly. She planted her feet more deliberately into the earth, feeling the solid warmth of it. The earth was warm, she noticed, warmer than it should have been in the middle of the night, as if the ground itself was giving something back, in exchange for what the gate was taking. She breathed slowly and steadily. Then the sound came. She had not heard it before in 31 years of keeping the gate. Not in the 6-hour night 12 years ago. Not in any of the hundreds of ordinary evenings when she had stood here and listened carefully. It was a low sound, very deep and very slow, rhythmic, coming from beyond the iron or perhaps through it, a sound like breathing, except that the space between each breath was far too long to belong to anything that breathed the way living things breathed. 20 seconds of silence. One low, slow exhalation, then 20 seconds again, then the sound, over and over. Agnes kept her hands exactly where they were. She kept her breathing even, and focused on the steadiness of the pressure she was applying, and did not allow the sound to pull her full attention away from that. The latch rattled twice, quickly, harder than it had rattled before. Agnes pressed forward. She did not respond to the sound with words or acknowledgement. Her mother had been clear on this point. In the first hours, you give nothing beyond the holding itself. You hold and you wait, and you do not engage with anything except the single fact of keeping the gate closed. The sound from beyond the gate continued for what she estimated at about 40 minutes, then stopped without transition, simply not recurring when the next 20 seconds had passed. The cold did not diminish after the sound stopped. If anything, it steadied, became more even and more committed. Agnes recognized this from the teaching. After the sound, the gate would push harder. This was not the end. This was the end of the first phase. She began to say the keeper's words quietly. Not the full version. The full version would come when it was needed. But the shorter form her mother had taught her first. The words meant for the sustained vigil. She said them in a low voice, more breath than sound, and saying them helped her breathing stay even, and helped her mind stay where it needed to stay. They reminded her of what she was, and what her presence here meant, in terms that reached back past her personal fear and her personal pain, to something larger and older than either. The sky behind her, in the direction of the village, began its first barely visible shift, from black toward the deepest gray. Not dawn yet, just the suggestion that dawn was a real possibility somewhere ahead in the night. She had been standing at the gate for approximately 7 hours. Her palms were aching with a deep, specific ache that was not quite pain but was something very close to it. Her shoulders had settled into a fixed tension she could not release without changing the angle of her arms, and she could not change the angle without losing evenness of pressure against the gate, so the tension stayed. Her lower back was registering its objections. Her knees, which had been reliable all her life, were beginning to offer small, polite notifications that they had been standing on hard ground for a very long time. She assigned each physical complaint to a portion of her attention, acknowledged it, and kept the largest part of herself on the gate. The gate was what mattered. Her body was the mechanism. The mechanism had not failed her yet, and she had not yet asked it for its full capacity. She heard the first bird of the morning, a small, tentative sound from somewhere in the village behind her, testing the pre-dawn air. Then silence again. Then another bird, further to the north, answering. She held on. She thought about what the full teaching had contained, not just the words and the techniques, how to hold, where to press, how to breathe. But the philosophy of it, the understanding of what the gate was, and what the keeper's relationship to it meant. Her mother had said, once, near the end of the teaching period, when Agnes was 31, and just a year from taking the role, "You will be surprised when it begins, by how much of it is about trust." Agnes had asked what she meant. Edith had said, trust of the gate. Trust that it is what it is, and not something else. Trust that what you feel in your hands is real information, and not imagination. Trust that what your mother and your mother's mother, and the ones before them said was true, because they said it honestly, and they had reason to know. She had paused. And trust of yourself, that you are capable of this, that you were not chosen wrongly. Those are the things that will be tested in the difficult moments, not your strength, your trust. Agnes had thought about this many times over the subsequent years. She had found her mother was right. In the difficult moments, the moments when the cold was worst and the hours were longest, and the loneliness of the work was most acute, it was always trust that was being asked for, and trust that either held or did not hold. And the holding of it was not a matter of willpower, but of something deeper and more settled than willpower. You either knew what you knew or you did not, and Agnes knew what she knew. She had gone over the teaching in her mind many times in the past week, ever since she first noticed the smell at the gate. Not in the abstract way that one reviews a lesson, but in the specific way of someone checking their equipment before a difficult crossing, methodically, carefully, with the understanding that what she found in good order she could rely on, and what she found wanting she needed to address before she reached the water. She had found the teaching in good order. Everything her mother had given her was there, intact, accessible, ready. She had found, in the going over of it, one thing her mother had said that she had not thought about in years. When it breathes, it has already decided to try. When it breathes, it is not asking permission. It is telling you what is coming. She had felt it breathe. It had already decided to try. This was what she was dealing with, and she was dealing with it alone, in the dark, with both palms on the iron, and the stars above Fairholme burning very bright and very far away. There was one more thing Edith had told her that she had not thought about in many years but that came to her now, standing in the dark at the gate in the deep hours of the first night. Edith had said it in the third year of Agnes's preparation, when Agnes was 30 and Edith was 64, and they both understood that the transfer was not far off. She had said, "The hardest part is not the holding. The hardest part is the knowing that the holding might not be enough. And learning to hold anyway." Agnes had asked what she meant. What if the holding was not enough? Edith had looked at her for a long moment. "It has always been enough," she said. "In this line, in this place, with this gate, it has always been enough. But you will have moments when you doubt that, and the doubt will feel very certain, and you will have to hold through the doubt, which is harder than holding through the cold or the pain." She paused. "I am telling you this so that when the doubt comes, you recognize it for what it is. Not information, a test." Agnes held through the doubt now. She had felt it arrive in the deepest hour, around 2 in the morning, when the cold was at its worst, and the sound from beyond the gate had not yet come, and she was alone in the dark, with no indication that anything she was doing was making any difference at all. She had felt it arrive, and she had recognized it, the way her mother had promised she would, and she had held through it the way her mother had said she would need to hold through it. And the dawn was coming. It was Clara who found her. Clara was 47 years old and had lived next door to Agnes for 22 years, and in those 22 years, she had developed a habit of quiet, unannounced watchfulness over her neighbor. She did not make a ceremony of this, and she did not speak of it. She simply paid attention. She was the kind of neighbor who noticed things and who had learned that noticing things about Agnes was more valuable than acting on them without being asked. She had gone to bed the previous evening while Agnes's lamp was still visible through her window, as it always was on Agnes's evening walk evenings, burning steadily in the front room until Agnes came home and turned it off. Clara had not waited for the lamp to go out. She had fallen asleep before it did, but somewhere in the last part of her sleep, before she was fully conscious of being awake, she had been aware of the lamp not having gone out the way it usually did, and when she opened her eyes at first light, that awareness was already sitting in her, waiting. She looked through her window. Agnes's lamp was not burning, but the door of Agnes's house was closed, the way it would be closed if Agnes were inside. Clara rose and wrapped her cloth around herself against the early morning cool, and crossed to her neighbor's door. She knocked. She waited. She knocked again. She pressed the latch and pushed the door open. They did not lock their doors in Fairholme, and found the house empty and the sleeping mat undisturbed. Clara had stood in the doorway of that empty house for exactly the length of one long breath. Then she pulled the door closed behind her and began to walk. She walked quickly, which is a different thing from running. Running conveys panic, and panic serves almost nothing. Walking quickly conveys urgency with intention, and that was what this moment required. She took the path to the eastern edge of the village, past the well and the church and the last houses, and came around the bend and stopped. Agnes was standing at the gate with both palms pressed flat against the iron bars. Her back was to Clara. Her feet were planted in the red earth with the particular deliberateness of someone who had consciously chosen that exact position and would not be moved from it. Her arms were straight and her shoulders were set, and her posture was the posture of someone who had been in exactly this position for a long time and intended to remain in it for a longer time still. Clara stood at the edge of the path and looked at her neighbor and felt something move through her chest that she could not name with any word she had available. "Agnes," she said. "I know," Agnes said. Her voice was level, unhurried. She might have been answering a question about the morning weather. "How long have you been here?" "Since before midnight," Agnes said. "Go and tell Walter. Tell Herbert too. Nobody else yet. Go now." Clara looked at Agnes's hands on the iron, at the way the fingers were spread flat, the palms pressing with obvious and sustained effort, the wrists slightly bent to maximize the surface contact. She had seen Agnes touch the gate on her evening walks many times from a distance. A brief press of one hand, a pause, then walking home. This was not that. Nothing about this was that. "Are you all right?" Clara asked. "I am holding," Agnes said. "Clara, go." Clara went. The village was beginning its morning. Cooking fires were being lit along the main path, thin threads of wood smoke rising into the pale morning air. A group of children appeared in the distance, heading toward the school, and Clara altered her route to avoid them. She reached Walter's house, a slightly elevated structure on the western side of the village, and knocked. His assistant Herbert opened the door before the second knock had fully sounded, as if he had already been close to the door, waiting for something. Clara said, "Agnes is at the gate. She has been there since before midnight." Herbert's expression changed in a way that Clara found impossible to fully read. What she could see clearly was that it was not the expression of someone receiving news they did not understand. It was the expression of someone receiving news they had been prepared to receive, even if they had hoped it would not come. He said, "How does she look?" "She looks like she has been standing at that gate all night," Clara said. "She looks the way she always looks, except standing at that gate." She told me to come for Walter. Walter appeared behind Herbert almost immediately, already wearing his chief's cloth and standing fully upright. He asked Clara 2 questions. Had Agnes said anything, and were her hands on the iron? Clara told him exactly what she had seen and exactly what Agnes had told her. Walter nodded once and said to Herbert, "Go to Leonard. I will go to the gate." He looked at Clara. "Go back to her. Stay nearby, but don't block the path." Clara went back. Herbert went to the church. The news moved through the village with the particular speed and quality of news that matters. Not explosive, not panicked, but precise and sequential, from mouth to ear to mouth to ear, each person receiving it and settling it before passing it on, because people in Fairholme understood, not by rule, but by the long practice of a close community, that some kinds of information needed to be received carefully. By the time Walter arrived at the eastern path, 5 people were behind him. By the time Leonard arrived 20 minutes later, the crowd numbered 12. A young man named George came with the first group that arrived. George was 22, broad-shouldered, and possessed of the energy and good intentions of someone his age who had not yet learned the distinction between courage and usefulness. He saw an older woman standing at the gate who had clearly been there all night and processed the situation according to what he understood, which was that the right thing to do was to help her away from there. He walked up to Agnes's side, reached toward her arm, and said, "Come away now. Let me take you home." Agnes said, without turning her head, "Do not touch me." George stopped with his hand an inch from her arm. "If you break my contact with this gate," Agnes said, in the same level voice she had used with Clara, "I cannot tell you what will happen. But I know it will not be good. Step back." George stepped back. His face went through several expressions before settling into something that, had he been older, he might have called respect, though he was not yet old enough to name it easily. Walter arrived as this was happening. He came to stand about 6 feet behind Agnes, close enough to be reachable, far enough to give her all the space around her that he could. "Agnes," he said. "Walter," she said. "How is it?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It has been pushing since before midnight. It has not lessened." Walter looked at the gate over her shoulders. He could see nothing unusual. Dark iron bars, simple latch, the wooden posts at either side. He knew this was normal. The gate's activity did not manifest visibly to anyone but the keeper in contact with it. Arthur had told him this years ago when Walter had first been given the full story, and standing here now, looking at a gate that looked like nothing more than a gate, while the woman in front of it was clearly holding it closed with her entire body, he understood in a different way than he had understood then. "What do you need?" he asked. "Water," Agnes said, "and someone to stay." "I am staying," Walter said. He was 70 years old, and his knees had been speaking to him more often in the mornings than they used to, and he had intended to rest today, after a week of disputes to settle. None of that was relevant now. He was staying. He would stay until it was finished. Leonard arrived, slightly breathless from walking quickly. He was a tall, thin man with reading glasses permanently pushed up onto his forehead, and a habit of needing to consciously remind himself to stand straight. He came to stand beside Walter and looked at the scene in front of him for a long, careful moment, at Agnes's posture, at her hands on the iron, at the space the crowd was instinctively maintaining behind her. And then he pressed his hands together and bowed his head briefly, in private prayer, and raised it, and remained. "Is it serious?" he said to Walter, very quietly. "Yes," Walter said. Leonard nodded. He did not ask another question. He had been in Fairholme for 26 years, and there were some questions he had learned, over those years, to recognize as questions that would not be answered by asking. Clara returned with a cup of water. She came to Agnes's side and said, "I have water." And Agnes said, "Hold it to my mouth." And Clara did, and Agnes drank without lifting her hands from the iron. It was a particular sight, a 63-year-old woman, drinking water held to her lips by her neighbor, while pressing both palms against an iron gate, and no one who was watching commented on it, because it was clearly exactly what needed to happen. The crowd behind Agnes had grown to close to 30 people by mid-morning. Word had reached the 3 mothers, Nora, Grace, and Mabel, whose children had been ill for the past 4 days, and all 3 had come without being summoned. No one had told any of them directly that the gate was connected to their children's illness. They had simply come, drawn by the same instinct that had been turning their children's eyes toward the east for days. They had come, and they had stayed. Nora stood in the crowd with her arms wrapped around herself and her eyes on Agnes's back, and prayed in a way that required no words, and no posture, and no form. Only the total concentrated urgency of a mother, whose child was sick, and who was standing near the only thing that she believed, without being able to explain why she believed it, might help. Grace was also there, having left May in the care of a neighbor, sitting with her cloth wrapped tight around her, and her eyes on Agnes's back, and her rosary in her hands. Mabel had come and gone twice already, returning from her house each time after checking on Rose, and each time she came back, the circle of people at the gate had grown, and the light had shifted, and Agnes's hands had still not moved. The morning went on. The crowd organized around Agnes the way water organizes around a stone in a stream, taking the shape of what was there, finding its own level, maintaining a clear space around the one thing that was fixed. Some people went home and came back. Some people left food and water for others. Some people sat down on the ground and stayed. Nobody sent them away. Nobody organized them. They were simply there, which was what the moment required. Clara had been gone for 20 minutes, when Agnes heard the first sounds of the village responding. She could not see any of this. She was facing the gate, and could not turn. But she had spent 31 years developing a specific awareness of what was behind her, and she listened now to the sounds coming up the path, the way a person reads a text they cannot see, by the reactions of the people reading it to them. She heard voices, at first just 1 or 2, then more. She heard the particular quality of footsteps that belonged to a group of people who were moving with purpose, but had not yet coalesced into a single direction. She heard Walter's voice, distinguishable even at distance by its particular quality of measured authority, say something she could not make out. She pressed her hands more firmly against the iron. She was aware, in those early minutes when the village was beginning to know, of a feeling she had not expected, something that was not quite relief, and not quite gratitude, but was adjacent to both. She had spent 31 years being the gatekeeper alone, not entirely without knowledge or support. Walter had always known, Arthur had always known, Leonard had come to understand over his years in the village, but alone, in the sense that the work itself was hers, and hers only, and could not be shared or distributed, or handed to someone else for a rest. She had accepted this without particular complaint, because it was the nature of the role, and she was not a person given to resenting the nature of things. But hearing the village begin to come, hearing the first sounds of the people of Fairholme moving toward her, she understood that she had not known until this moment how much the aloneness had weighed. She did not show this. She pressed her hands against the iron, and kept her breathing even, and kept her mind on the gate. But she filed the feeling, the way she filed everything, carefully, in the right place, for later. Nora had brought Oliver to the edge of the path when Clara passed her house, because Nora was a woman who noticed things, and what she had noticed in Clara's face and Clara's walk was enough to stop her in the middle of her morning work and gather her son and follow. Nora had no explanation for this to give Oliver, who asked where they were going, and she told him they were going to see something, which satisfied him in the way that simple, honest answers satisfy children who trust the person giving them. She had not expected, when she arrived at the eastern end of the path, to find Agnes at the gate in the posture she found her in, and what happened in Nora's body when she saw it was a thing she would not try to describe to anyone for a very long time, not because it was frightening, but because it was the opposite of frightening, because it was something she had not known she had been waiting to see. Oliver, in her arms, turned his head slowly and looked at the gate. His eyes had that quality she had been frightened by for 4 days, that listening quality, that distance. But here, facing this direction, the distance did not seem like illness. It seemed like attention directed at exactly the right thing. Nora held him and stayed. Leonard reached the gate at around 7 in the morning, while some of the early crowd was still finding its position. He had walked quickly from the church, where Herbert had found him praying at the altar, and he had not taken the time to change from his prayer clothes into his daily ones, so he arrived in the old pale shirt he wore for early prayer, with his reading glasses on his forehead where they always were, and his feet in the simple sandals he wore indoors. He looked at Agnes for a long time before he approached Walter. He had been in Fairholme for 26 years. He had conducted more than 40 funerals in those years, and he had sat beside more deaths than he could count accurately without records, and he had prayed at bedsides and in corridors, and once in a field, when a man had been struck by something falling from a tree, and Leonard had happened to be nearby. He had, in 26 years, built a working relationship with the mystery of human mortality. Not an easy relationship, not a comfortable one, but a working one. The kind where you have agreed with the thing you cannot change to at least stand in each other's presence without flinching. What he was looking at now was different from anything in those 26 years. He was looking at someone standing at the boundary between the living and the dead, holding the boundary closed, with both hands. Not metaphorically, with both hands. He was looking at the physical fact of a woman who had been in contact with that boundary all night, and whose body showed what contact with it cost, and who had not let go. He pressed his hands together and stood straight, and prayed in the way he prayed when he understood that the situation was beyond what he could manage, and was also exactly where he was supposed to be. Arthur arrived at mid-morning, walking along the eastern path with his cane, and no one had sent for him. He had heard the news through the ordinary mechanisms of a small village that had been awake long enough for important things to reach all its corners, and he had dressed and come, because he was 68 years old, and had known Agnes since she was a child, and had known her mother Edith before that, and had carried in his memory for 43 years the story of the only other time, the only other confirmed instance in anyone's living memory, that the gatekeeper had been required to hold the gate for more than a single sustained effort. He had carried this story the way he carried all the village's important stories, fully, carefully, and with the understanding that there would eventually be a moment when it needed to be given. That moment had come. He walked through the crowd without hurrying. People made way for him automatically, the way people make way for someone whose presence is understood to matter without needing explanation. He went to the front and stood about 10 feet behind Agnes and looked at her back and at her hands on the iron and at the space the crowd was maintaining around her. And he stood there for a long time without saying anything to anyone. He was a man who believed in looking fully at something before speaking about it. He looked. Then he went to Walter and Leonard, who were standing together at the side, and he said, without preamble, speaking quietly, "The last time this happened was 43 years ago. Edith held the gate for 2 days, and most of a third. She did not speak about what she experienced while holding it. She told me afterward that at the end, it felt as though the gate had made a decision to stay closed, rather than continue pressing. She described it as a shift in the weather, not dramatic, just a settling, the way a wind decides to stop. She recovered in about 10 days. He paused, looking across at Agnes. Her hands were damaged. Walter said, "How damaged?" "She had the full use of them afterward," Arthur said. "She carried the marks until the end of her life. The skin on her palms was never quite the same as it had been before. The texture was different. She used to say, they felt more like they belonged to someone else than to her." He looked at Walter steadily. "I am telling you this so that we are not surprised when we see it beginning." Leonard pressed his hands together and looked at the ground for a moment. Walter said, "Agnes knows this risk." "Agnes knows every risk there is to know," Arthur said. "She has known them for 31 years. She would know them better than I do. That does not change the fact that we should be prepared for what we are going to see over the next day or two." They organized after that, with the particular efficiency of people who understand that a situation is serious and that fussing about it will not help. Herbert produced a wide square of cloth and rigged it above Agnes's head as a shade against the direct morning sun. He did not ask Agnes's permission, and she did not acknowledge the shade, but when it settled into position above her, something in the line of her shoulders released a fraction of its tension. A woman named Dorothy arrived at around mid-morning and placed herself 5 feet directly behind Agnes, without asking anyone, and without explaining herself. Dorothy was 60 years old and had been a contemporary of Edith's in the village. She had known Edith the way people know someone important who lives nearby, with respect and a certain careful distance, understanding that proximity to the gatekeeper was a privilege to be treated thoughtfully. She had known what Edith was, roughly, and she knew what Agnes was, and she knew, from whatever combination of knowledge and instinct had brought her here, what needed to be done now. She stood. She watched Agnes's back. She was there. Another woman, Ruth, arrived shortly after, and placed herself near Dorothy, without exchanging words with her. Ruth was 55, and had grown up in Fairholme, and had absorbed over a lifetime the particular village understanding of the gate, not the full technical knowledge that Walter and Arthur and Leonard held, but the deeper kind of knowledge that comes from living all your life near something important and allowing that importance to become part of your understanding of the world, without demanding that it explain itself to you. She stood beside Dorothy. She was there too. Between Dorothy and Ruth and Agnes, an unspoken space formed, about 5 feet wide and 5 feet deep, a clear area that the rest of the crowd instinctively maintained without being asked. Nobody directed them. Nobody announced it. The space simply appeared, and people arranged themselves around it, and it remained. Frank, the goat farmer, arrived at the gate around mid-morning. He was a big man, practical and broad through the chest, with large working hands, and the air of someone who had always found that most mysteries dissolved quickly under direct examination. He had come because he had heard what was happening, and because the goats had been refusing to go east for 6 days, and he had been thinking about those goats, and what they meant more and more, as the morning went on, and he had reached a point where not going to see for himself was less comfortable than going. He stood at the back of the crowd and watched Agnes's posture and watched the crowd and said nothing. After a while he moved to the side where a few people were managing the practical concerns, the water supply, the organization of the space, the question of who would go back to check on things in the village, and he began helping. He was a man who responded to difficult things by finding something useful to do, and there were useful things to do, and he did them. A little before noon, Arthur told a story. He told it to Walter and Leonard, and to the small group of people nearby who were old enough and present enough to receive it properly, and he told it quietly, the way important things in Fairholme were always told, not performed, not decorated, but given plainly, with respect for the weight of what was being passed. He told them about the year the gate had pressed before. He had been 25 then, not yet an elder, Only a young man, who knew some of the village's deeper history, because his own father had taught him. He had not been at the gate when Edith held it. No one had, that first time. Edith had held it alone, and told no one until afterward. But he had seen Edith's hands when she came home. He had been one of the 3 people she told the truth to, because 3 people had always known, and one of the 3 had just died, and she needed someone new to hold the knowledge. He told them what Edith had described to him, that the cold in the gate had been worse than cold, that it had reached into her bones in a way that ordinary cold did not, and that she had held on through it by concentrating on the warm ground under her feet, which had been warm even in the coldest hours of the night, as if the earth itself were giving her something to stand on, in exchange for what the gate was taking. He told them she had heard a sound on the second night, a deep and rhythmic sound from beyond the gate, and that she had not responded to it, because the tradition said you did not respond to it in the early phases. He told them she had said the names on the night of the second day, as the tradition required, and that what had come back to her in the silence after she spoke the names was not a sound, but a change in pressure, the gate pulling back, not all at once, but in the way a very large thing moves when it has decided to stop. Walter listened to all of this without interrupting. Leonard listened with his head slightly bowed and his hands folded. When Arthur finished, there was a silence. Then Leonard said, "Is there anything the tradition says to do that we are not doing?" Arthur looked at him for a moment. "The tradition says the gatekeeper holds the gate," he said. "Everything else, the people who stay, the singing, the prayers, the practical care, these are not part of the tradition. They are what communities do. They are what we do." Leonard nodded. A little before noon, the gate moved. Not visibly. Not in any way that changed the appearance of the iron or the latch or the posts. But Agnes's posture changed in an instant, and completely. Her back went rigid, her arms locked straight, and she drove her body forward against the iron with a sudden force that made every person watching go silent before they had consciously processed what they were seeing. A vibration moved through the air near the gate. Something felt more than heard, a deep tremor that those closest to Agnes perceived as a subtle pressure in their chests and ears. Dorothy moved forward without hesitation and placed her shoulder against Agnes's right shoulder, adding her weight. Ruth did the same on the left. From somewhere behind them in the crowd, 3 other women stepped forward and placed their hands on Dorothy's and Ruth's backs, a human chain that extended and shared the pressure, without anyone giving instructions. The vibration held for approximately 20 seconds. In those 20 seconds, not a single person spoke. The ordinary ambient sounds of the village, a child's voice in the distance, the grinding mill, a rooster, became very distinct against the silence, which made them seem very far away. Then the vibration eased. Agnes breathed out. One long, controlled exhalation, the first sound anyone had heard from her in several hours. Dorothy and Ruth stepped back a half step but stayed close. The women behind them released their hands and returned to their positions in the crowd, and the crowd itself began to breathe again. Walter, who had watched it all from 6 feet back, with his hands at his sides and his face completely still, looked at Leonard. Leonard looked back. Neither of them said anything. Frank, who had been working at the side of the crowd, had stopped everything he was doing. He stood with his arms at his sides and looked at Agnes's back and at the space around the gate. He was a man who believed in what he could see. He could see this. His goats had stopped going east 6 days ago, and he had thought they were being peculiar. They had not been being peculiar. They had known something that he had not known, and a 63-year-old woman had stood at a gate for more than 12 hours and was still standing, and the vibration had moved through the air, and he had felt it, and he could not stand in the face of all of that and maintain his original position. He went back to work. But something in him had changed, quietly and permanently, and would continue to change throughout the afternoon. Agnes's knees were beginning to tremble slightly. Only Dorothy and Ruth, positioned closest, could see the trembling, a small, continuous vibration in Agnes's legs below the knee, the kind that comes from sustained effort, applied long past the point where the muscles have made their case for rest. Agnes said nothing about it. Dorothy and Ruth said nothing about it. They stayed where they were, close and ready. The afternoon was coming, with its heat and its light, and the gate was still closed, and Agnes was still holding it. A woman named Edith, not Agnes's mother, but a younger woman who had lived in Fairholme for 12 years, and had built her life there, as fully as if she had been born there, had come to the gate in the late morning, and had begun, without being asked, to organize a system for water distribution. She had a clear, practical intelligence, and the useful habit of seeing what needed to be done and doing it, without first checking whether someone else had already taken responsibility. Within an hour she had established a rotation, 2 people at a time going back to the well and returning with full containers so that the crowd never ran short. This was not something the tradition required. This was simply what people do. Frank watched this organization emerge and watched other small practical systems emerge alongside it. The shade over Agnes's head, the management of the crowd's position to keep the space behind Agnes clear, the quiet circulation of food that someone had brought from their house. And he thought about the way systems appear when people understand the nature of a situation. You did not need to tell a Fairholme woman to organize water distribution when 60 people were gathered in the heat. She understood that this was what was needed, and she organized it. You did not need to tell people to stay back from Agnes. They understood that the space needed to stay clear, and they maintained it. There was intelligence here that was not in any individual's head, but in the shared understanding of a community that had been a community for a very long time. He understood something about the gate in that observation, though he could not have explained the connection directly. He understood it in the way that farmers sometimes understand things, not through logic, but through the recognition of a pattern, the same pattern in a different form. He kept working. Arthur, having delivered his account of Edith's vigil 43 years ago, had settled himself at a position near Walter and Leonard, and had not moved from it. He was 68, and he had walked to the gate on a bad leg, and he was not going to walk back before it was finished. He sat on a folded blanket someone provided, and watched Agnes's back, and watched the crowd, and watched the gate, and he thought his slow, thorough thoughts about the long history of what this place was, and what this woman was doing in it. He had been 25 when Edith had held the gate, and he had not known it was happening until it was over, and the not knowing had stayed with him for 43 years as a particular kind of regret. Not a guilty regret, because he had not been negligent, only uninformed, but the regret of someone who understands that something important happened in a place they were absent from. He had understood, from the moment Edith told him what she had done, that he was now responsible for making sure the next time was different, that the next gatekeeper should not be alone with it, if it was possible for her not to be. He had done his best. He had told Walter. He had kept the knowledge alive. He had stayed in Fairholme when it would have been easier to leave, in the years when the younger people were going to the city, and the village was contracting slightly, and the question of whether Fairholme would remain viable was genuinely open. He looked at Agnes's back and he thought, "You held it, Edith, and now Agnes holds it, and after Agnes, Pearl will hold it." He looked at Pearl's face across the crowd, Pearl, who was standing at her position 10 feet behind Agnes, with an attention that was unmistakable once you knew what to look for, and he thought, yes, that one. Good. The sun reached its highest point and began to descend, and the afternoon spread itself over the village of Fairholme with full heat and full light. Nora came forward in the early afternoon with Oliver in her arms. She did not approach the gate directly. She did not try to speak to Agnes. Something stopped her at the edge of the 5-foot space behind Agnes, the same invisible boundary the crowd had been maintaining since morning without anyone defining it, and she stopped there with her son's head on her shoulder and his body curled against her, heavy and warm. Oliver was awake. His eyes, which had carried for 4 days a quality of distance and distraction that Nora had found more frightening than the fever, that quality of a child listening to something in a room no one else could enter, were today slightly clearer, not fully himself yet, but less far away than he had been, as if the frequency of whatever he had been receiving was beginning to soften. Nora stood in that space and held her son, and looked at Agnes's back, and did not speak. She did not need to speak. She was a woman who had spent her whole life in Fairholme, and she understood, without needing it explained, that Agnes was not a resource to be accessed, or an authority to petition. Agnes was simply there, doing what she was doing, and the most useful thing Nora could do was be there too, and not add to what Agnes was carrying. Oliver rested his head on his mother's shoulder. His eyes moved, slowly, toward the gate. Agnes was aware of the child, in the way she was aware of everything happening behind her in those hours, not through vision, since she could not turn, but through a peripheral consciousness that had been extending backward from her all day, registering the crowd, the changes in it, the quality of people's presence. She felt the child the way you sometimes feel when someone very young and not fully well is nearby. A particular quality in the air around them, different from the air around adults, more open in some way, more permeable. She felt it, and she noted it, and she pressed harder against the gate, because it clarified what she was holding and why. May's grandmother Grace had arrived earlier in the afternoon and settled herself on a low wooden stool that someone had brought from a nearby house. She held her rosary in both hands and prayed with the particular steadiness of a woman who had been praying continuously all her life and had learned that prayer, at its most real, was not about urgency or volume, but about the simple, persistent act of showing up and remaining. Her lips moved without sound. Her eyes stayed open and fixed on Agnes's back. Dorothy began to sing at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. She did not prepare or announce it. She simply began. It was a song that people in Fairholme knew from childhood. Not a church hymn exactly, not a traditional ceremony song exactly, but the kind that belonged to difficult hours, the kind that had accumulated its meaning not through formal designation, but through the accumulated practice of being sung during things that were hard. People sang it at bedsides. They sang it when the rains did not come, and then again, when the rains came at last. They sang it at burials, and at the long watches of the night, when something important was happening, that required the human voice to mark it. Dorothy sang it in a low voice, almost to herself, not performing it for anyone. Within 2 minutes, Ruth had joined her. Within 5 minutes, 4 more women from the crowd had joined them, and then 2 more, and then more still, each person adding their voice not with any announcement or decision, but simply because the song was already there in the air, and their voices knew it, and wanted to be part of it. The singing built the way something real builds, not from design, but from the accumulation of individual responses to something that already exists and is true. The singing settled over the gathering, the way warmth settles in a room where enough people have gathered, not through any single action, but through the combined presence of many. It was soft and continuous, and it had a directional quality, as if it were aimed at something specific, which in a sense it was. Agnes heard it begin. She heard it build. She heard it settle into the steady, layered sound it became. She did not show any visible response, but something in the muscles across her upper back changed very slightly, a fraction of an easing in the tension that had been there since the night before, the first easing that had not come from her own internal management. Something in the sound was doing what her internal management could not fully do alone, and she accepted it, the way a person dying of thirst accepts water that has arrived, without ceremony, without turning to look at who brought it, simply receiving it. Leonard moved to a position a few feet to Agnes's left and slightly behind her, and began to pray aloud, quietly, in a voice barely louder than the singing. He prayed without any request for Agnes to respond or participate. He did not ask anything of the situation, or make any claims about what was happening. He simply prayed, steadily and continuously, with the specific quality of a man who had done enough long vigils to know that the most useful prayer at such a time is not petition but presence, the simple statement, in whatever form you know how to make it, that you are there and you are not leaving. The sun went lower. The shadows from the eastern trees stretched longer across the flat ground beyond the gate. The iron, as the day's heat began to leave it, went colder under Agnes's hands, and she felt this change clearly, and adjusted the depth of her breathing to compensate, taking in slightly more air with each breath, to offset what the cold was doing to the muscles in her forearms. Her physical state was not something she spoke about, and not something she would speak about, but it was making itself known to her in detailed and specific ways that required management. Her palms had been under sustained cold pressure for close to 16 hours. The ache that had started at the wrists in the early morning hours had by now extended through both hands fully, and into the first 2 joints of each finger. The muscles in both forearms had stiffened past the point where ordinary stiffness applied, into something more total, a kind of occupation of the tissue that made her forearms feel less like her own limbs, and more like tools she was operating. Her shoulders were fixed at a tension she could not release without changing the angle of her arms, which she could not do. Her lower back had long ago progressed from complaint to a steady statement of fact that she was simply incorporating into her awareness of the situation. She managed all of this. She assigned each sensation to a portion of her attention, acknowledged it, and kept the largest part of herself forward, on the gate. Herbert had disappeared in the mid-afternoon, gone back to the village on some errand, and returned carrying a glass lamp. He lit it with a match and set it carefully on the earth at Agnes's feet, positioned so that its light fell upward along the gate without shining in anyone's eyes. It was practical. The path would be dark soon, and the lamp would be useful. But it was also something else. A lamp kept at someone's feet as a vigil. Everyone who saw it understood this without being told, and the understanding changed the quality of the gathering in a way that was subtle but real, the way a small shift in light changes the character of a room. Frank, who had been at the edges of the crowd all afternoon managing practical things, moved in the late afternoon to a position within the main gathering body of people and stood there without drawing attention to it. He had been thinking all afternoon, doing the internal work that honest practical people do when the world has shown them something that does not fit their framework. Not discarding the framework all at once, but making the adjustments that honesty required, one at a time, until what remained was something different from what he had started with. He was not finished with this process. He might never be fully finished with it, but he was no longer standing at the edge. Walter came to stand close to Agnes's left side as the sun finished its descent and the sky began the transition from orange to gray. Agnes said, very quietly, without turning her head, 3 words. "Do not leave." Walter said, "I am not leaving." She did not speak again. But what Walter heard in those 3 words, and he would think about them many times in the years that followed, was not the voice of someone who was losing ground. It was not fear, and it was not desperation. It was something simpler and more complete. The voice of a person who understood exactly what the night ahead required, and who was asking, with perfect clarity, for the one thing that would help. She needed to know that she was not alone, not because being alone would break her. Agnes had held things alone her entire life, but because the night ahead was a different kind of holding, and it needed witness. The night came down over Fairholme, and the lamp at Agnes's feet was the brightest steady light at the eastern edge of the village, and the singing had softened to a low, continuous thread of sound that moved through the dark air like something living, and the gate stood in the dark, exactly as it always had, and Agnes stood in front of it. The singing had been going for half an hour when something changed in its quality. It had begun as 3 or 4 voices and had grown to 20 or more, and the voices had found each other and found the song's rhythm and had been holding it steady, layer on layer, soft and continuous. But around 3:30, something in the singing shifted. It deepened. It became slower by a fraction. The people who were singing became more deliberate about it, less automatic, and the change in their deliberateness changed the sound from something that happened to be there to something that was being directed, aimed, as purposeful as prayer. Because it was prayer. Dorothy knew this. It had always been prayer, this particular song, even before anyone called it that. Several people at the back of the crowd who had not been singing began to sing. One of them was Frank. He had not known he was going to sing. He did not think of himself as someone who sang in public. But the song was one he had known since he was small, had known it the way you know things you were given when you were young before you were old enough to decide what to accept and what to refuse. And his mouth opened and his voice came out, and it was not a remarkable voice, but it was his, and it was there, and it joined what was already there, and that was what mattered. Agnes heard the deepening. She did not turn. She did not change her position or her expression, but she breathed, once, in a particular way, a breath that went very deep before it came back out, and something in the angle of her forearms adjusted by a fraction, and Dorothy, who had been watching her continuously, recognized the adjustment as the kind that happens when the body receives something it needed. Leonard had been praying for 7 hours by this time. He was still praying. He had been a pastor for 30 years, and had prayed in hospitals, and in homes, and in churches, and beside accidents on roads, and in his own house, at 3 in the morning, when faith was most difficult, and he knew the full range of what prayer was capable of. But he had not, until this evening, prayed while a woman in front of him held closed a door between the living and the dead, through the force of her hands and her will, and the authority of 6 generations of women who had done the same thing. He was finding that this prayer felt different from any he had prayed before, not louder or more urgent, quieter actually, more certain, as if the very specific reality of what was happening in front of him had made it unnecessary to persuade himself of anything, or to work against any doubt. The doubt was simply gone. What remained was the prayer, clean and clear. The sun was fully behind the trees now, and the light was the light of an hour that was not quite day, and not yet dark, that particular golden hour, when the air seems to hold its breath before the transition. The iron of the gate caught the last of it in long, oblique bars of orange light that moved upward along each bar and disappeared. Agnes was a silhouette in front of it, her arms straight, her feet planted, the perfect stillness of someone who has not moved in more than 15 hours. The lamp at her feet was lit now, and its warm circle of light covered the ground in front of Agnes and reached the lower bars of the gate, and in this light her hands were visible as shapes pressed flat against the iron, fingers spread, wrists bent slightly inward to maintain the maximum contact. The crowd was her village. They were all there. They had chosen to be there. This, Agnes thought, in the part of her that was not entirely consumed by the work of holding, this is what it means to belong somewhere. Herbert had come back to the gate just before dusk with the lamp, and with him he had brought also a small covered dish of food, which he placed near the lamp. He said nothing and left again. Clara picked up the dish and looked inside it, and found that it contained the kind of food that required no hands to eat. Soft, cooked things that could be fed to Agnes from a spoon without her lifting her hands from the iron. She set it aside for later, when Agnes would need it, which would be when Agnes told her, which would be when Agnes was ready. And Clara had learned over 32 years of being alive, and 47 years of being human, that readiness could not be hurried. Grace, who had been sitting on her stool all afternoon and was not going to move from it, watched Herbert go and come back. She was 60 years old and she had been in Fairholme for 60 years, and she had watched the village change in many ways over that time. People leaving and people arriving, the school getting its 4th room, the market shrinking and then growing again, the road to the nearest city getting paved, and then the pavement cracking and then getting repaved. She had watched all of this change, and she had watched the gate not change, and she had watched the gatekeeper not change in the ways that mattered, and she found that this continuity was one of the things she was most grateful for in her life, though she could not always have told you why. She watched Agnes's back in the falling dark, and she held her rosary, and she prayed for Rose, and for May, and for Oliver, and for Agnes, and for the village, and for the dead of the village, and for the living, and for whatever wisdom was required in the situation, and for the grace that followed wisdom, and she did not stop. The people who stayed through the first night stayed not because anyone asked them to, but because they could not bring themselves to leave. And in Fairholme, the distinction between those two things was clearly understood. Clara stayed because she had been the first one called, and she felt in her body that leaving before it was finished would be a kind of abandonment she could not explain, but was not willing to commit. She did not announce this decision. She simply did not go home when the crowd began to thin at the edges, as the evening turned to night. She moved quietly through the remaining people with water and with the practical, unobtrusive attention that had characterized her relationship with Agnes for 22 years, noticing what was needed and supplying it without drawing attention to herself or to the need. Walter stayed because he had said he would, and because Walter did not say things he did not mean. He was 70 years old, and he had not been planning on a night vigil, and he positioned himself on the ground, about 8 feet behind Agnes, with his chief's cloth around his shoulders, against the evening air, and he stayed. Herbert brought him a blanket without being asked, and he accepted it without comment. Leonard stayed because his vocation required witness, and he had never in 26 years of ministry been presented with a clearer and more direct call to that requirement than this one. He continued to pray, quietly and without pause, shifting between postures as his body required, standing for a while, then sitting, then standing again, the way a person who has kept many vigils learns to manage the physical demands of sustained prayer without losing the interior focus. Dorothy and Ruth stayed at their positions nearest to Agnes. They had not moved from those positions except briefly since morning. They did not sleep. They stood or sat according to what their bodies asked for, keeping their attention on Agnes continuously, watching for the changes in her posture that would tell them when to move forward and brace her. Frank stayed. This surprised people who knew Frank, though those people kept their surprise quiet out of courtesy. He had said nothing in particular after the noon vibration had passed, and he had felt it in his chest, and watched Agnes's arms hold the gate against something invisible and very large. He had simply continued with the practical work of the afternoon, and then had not gone home when the practical work of the afternoon was finished. He sat with the others at the edge of the fire that someone had built in the cleared space about 20 feet from the gate, and he was quiet, and he stayed. George, The young man who had tried to take Agnes's arm in the morning and been told not to, stayed too. He stayed partly because the attempt to leave had failed twice. He had started down the path toward home in the early evening and had stopped both times, without fully understanding why, turned around, and come back. He stayed because something in him had been changed by the day and was not finished being changed, and going home and sleeping felt like it would arrest that process midway through. The way leaving a room before a conversation is finished leaves both people with something incomplete. Nora stayed with Oliver, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder in the early evening, with his breathing steady and his face softer in sleep than it had been in 4 days. She had sat down on the ground and let his weight rest on her, and watched Agnes's back and prayed. She did not pray for anything specific in the way that prayers are sometimes shaped around specific requests. She simply sent everything she had, all her attention, all her care, all her fear, and all her love, in the direction of the woman at the gate, and let it be whatever it needed to be. Grace had gone home briefly, and returned with a thicker blanket and a cup of tea that had gone cold by the time she arrived back, and she sat on her stool with the blanket around her, and her rosary in her hands, and she continued. The transition from day to night moved through the crowd, and the crowd absorbed it. People arranged themselves on the ground, or stood, depending on what they could manage. A quiet, practical organization appeared without any direction. Those who had food shared it. Those with blankets let others share them. Those with nothing sat close to those with something, because closeness is its own form of warmth. The small fire in the cleared space burned steadily, throwing a warm, low light that reached the backs of the people between it and the gate without reaching Agnes herself. The lamp at Agnes's feet continued to burn. What Agnes was experiencing in those deep hours of the first night was not something she described in full afterward. She described pieces of it when asked, carefully and without embellishment. What she said about the temperature was this: the cold in the gate changed in the deep hours in a way she had not expected and had not been taught to expect. It went beyond what cold ordinarily means. She had been in refrigerated storage rooms in the city on the few occasions she had traveled there, and those rooms were cold in an ordinary way, measurable, predictable, the kind that clothing defeats and movement reduces. This was different. It had a quality of density to it, as if what was pressing through the iron had been concentrated over a very long time into something far more intense than ordinary cold. It reached past her palms into her wrists, and from her wrists up her forearms, and the muscles in her forearms began to stiffen in the way that muscles respond to sustained cold exposure. Gradually, irreversibly, past a certain point losing some of their usual quickness. She managed this. She noted it, incorporated it, and pressed harder. What she had not been told to expect, and what she would speak of later with something close to wonder, was the warmth of the earth under her feet. In the deep hours, well past midnight, she became fully aware that the ground beneath her bare feet was warm, not body temperature warm. Warmer than that, the kind of warmth that moves upward through the soles and into the bones of the legs and is undeniable. She was standing on red laterite earth in the middle of the night, in a region where nights were cool, and the earth beneath her feet was warm. She could feel it clearly against the cold that was pressing through the iron into her palms and arms, and the two things met somewhere in the middle of her torso as two opposing currents meet at a confluence. She stood between them, and she was held between them, and she thought, "The earth is giving me what the gate takes." She began to say the keeper's words. Not the shorter daily form she had said in the first hours. This was the full version, the long oral text her mother had given her in pieces over years, the complete form of what the tradition required when the gate was being held in earnest over multiple hours. She said it quietly, more breath than voice, the way a navigator says bearings to orient themselves. She said it slowly and completely, and saying it helped her find the center of herself again, in the hours when the cold was making it hardest to stay centered. Dorothy and Ruth, standing closest, could hear her speaking. They could not make out the words. They did not try to. They held their positions and let her say what she was saying. Then the sound came back. Not the small interior sound she had heard alone in the first hours. This was larger. This was a sound that every person in the vigil circle heard at the same moment, without any ambiguity about whether they were imagining it. It was very deep and very slow and rhythmic, and it came from beyond the gate or through the gate, and it was not the wind, and it was not an animal, and it was not anything that anyone present could identify from the inventory of their experience. It was a breathing sound, except that the space between each breath was 20 seconds long, and the sound itself was a single low exhalation that moved through the chest more than through the ears. The fire that someone had built in the cleared space threw its light over the faces of the people in the vigil circle at the moment the sound first arrived, and what those faces showed was not a single thing. Some people went very still, some closed their eyes. Some looked immediately at the people nearest to them, the instinctive human response to something that cannot be individually processed. One older woman at the back of the circle began to pray audibly for the first time that evening, in a low, continuous murmur that did not stop. George felt the impulse to step backward rise in him with a physical force, the way a wave rises and commits to its direction before it can be stopped. He felt his body already leaning backward, his weight already shifting toward the path that led home. He stepped back one pace, then another. Frank's hand came out without Frank looking at him, and closed around George's forearm. Not forcefully, not with any drama. Just a firm, steady grip that said, "Stop." George stopped. He stood still. He breathed. He looked at the lamp at Agnes's feet and fixed his attention on its small, steady flame, and kept it there. The sound continued, slow and deep and absolutely regular. 20 seconds of silence. One slow exhalation. 20 seconds again. It had the quality of something enormous, practicing patience, something that had been patient for a very long time, and saw no reason to change that now. Agnes said the keeper's words in the intervals between the sounds. She was silent during the sounds themselves. She had been taught to do exactly this, though hearing the teaching described and actually holding yourself silent through that sound were different experiences, and the distance between them was one of the things she was burning through in those hours. The sound continued for what Walter, later, would estimate at close to 50 minutes, counting backward from when it stopped and forward from when it began, and he arrived at approximately 50 minutes. It stopped in the same way it had started, not gradually but simply, by not recurring when the next interval had passed. Agnes had not moved. Her feet had not moved. Her hands had not moved. She had not flinched and had not shifted, and had not made any sound at all during the 50 minutes of it. After the sound stopped, the cold in the gate deepened. Agnes felt this as clearly and immediately as she had felt the cold's first arrival the night before, and she recognized it for what it was: consolidation, not retreat. The sound was not a retreat. It was a presentation of what was on the other side, and the cold deepening afterward was the gate deciding to press harder in the silence the sound had created. Agnes pressed harder to meet it. The night got darker before it got lighter, as all nights do in the last hour before dawn. The fire burned to coals. The lamp at Agnes's feet burned on. The people in the vigil circle sat or stood in the dark around it, and George stood where Frank's hand had stopped him, and did not move, and the first gray began to appear above the village, when none of them were watching for it, because they were all watching the lamp. What Frank experienced in the deepest hours of that first night was something he carried with him afterward, and rarely spoke about, but never forgot. He had been sitting at the edge of the fire that burned in the cleared space, about 20 feet from the gate, and he had been awake and still, and he had been thinking the slow thoughts of a man whose framework for the world was being dismantled piece by piece, and who was deciding, rather than resisting, to let it be dismantled. He was 49 years old, and had farmed his land for 25 years, and had prided himself on the uncomplicated clarity of his understanding. He understood animals, he understood weather, he understood soil and seed, and the particular personality of the eastern grazing land that his goats had been working for 15 years. He had thought he understood most things worth understanding. He was revising this. What he arrived at, in the long quiet hours of the night with the fire going to coals beside him and Agnes's back visible in the lamp's light ahead of him, was not a new belief that he had constructed to replace the old one. It was more like a recognition that there had always been a larger world than the one he had been looking at, and that he had been looking at the part he could see and calling it the whole, the way you look at one field and know that there are other fields on the other side of every wall, but do not think about them because you cannot see them. He could now, in some sense, see them. He did not find this disturbing. This surprised him. He had expected, in the moments before this night, that if he ever encountered something outside his established framework, it would be frightening. It was not. It was instead clarifying. Like the moment when you realize your map of a place is wrong, and you look up from the map and see the actual land and understand, Suddenly, why the map has never quite matched what you have been walking through. He sat by the dying fire and watched the lamp burn at Agnes's feet and listened to the deep sound that came from beyond the gate, and he was not afraid. He was simply there, paying attention, learning the shape of a world he had always lived in but had not fully seen. George beside him was trembling. The trembling was not cold, the night was warm enough, but the particular trembling of a young person encountering something they do not have a category for. Frank had felt this way himself at 22, multiple times, for much smaller reasons. He did not speak to George. He simply kept his hand on the younger man's arm until the trembling settled, which it did, after several minutes, when George made the internal decision to stay and mean it, rather than to stay because he was being held there. There is a difference between staying because something is holding you and staying because you have chosen to stay, and the difference matters in ways that go beyond the immediate situation and affect the shape of the person you are afterward. George chose to stay. The night went on. Clara moved through the vigil circle in the dark hours, refilling cups, adjusting lamps, checking on the people who had been there longest and were beginning to show the specific kind of tiredness that comes from sustained emotional attention rather than physical exertion. She knew how to recognize this tiredness. She had seen it in Agnes's face over 22 years of being her neighbor, in the days after a difficult birth or a difficult death, when the body was fine, but the interior had been used heavily. She had learned, in those 22 years, that the right response to this tiredness was not stimulation or conversation, but quiet, practical care, a refilled cup, a slight adjustment of position, the simple continued presence of someone who was going to stay. She applied this understanding to the vigil circle. She did her work quietly, and she did not speak unless spoken to, and she stayed in motion, because motion was her way of being present without adding weight to a situation that already had enough weight. Nora, sitting with Oliver sleeping against her, felt Clara's hand on her shoulder as Clara passed, and the touch lasted only a moment, but it was the exact kind of touch that said, "I see you, and you are not alone," and it was enough. George, sitting with his back against a tree at the edge of the circle, had stopped trembling after about an hour. He was awake, and he was there, and he was not going to leave, and he had arrived at this decision in the way that certain decisions are arrived at, not through reasoning but through the resolution of something that had been in conflict in him and had finally resolved. What had been in conflict was the 22-year-old part of him that had a specific framework for the world, and the part of him that was standing in a field in the dark, listening to a sound from beyond a gate, that had no place in that framework. The framework had lost. The sound was real. The woman was real. The cold in the gate was real, as evidenced by what it was doing to her hands, and he was there, and he was staying, and he was part of something, and being part of something was one of the best feelings he knew, and he had found it in the last place he had looked for it. The morning of the second day came in on a thin, pale gray light, the kind that precedes the sun by enough time that you could be forgiven for not being certain the sun was coming. Agnes had been standing at the gate for more than 30 hours. When Walter looked at her hands in the early light of day 2, he saw what Arthur had told him to expect, and seeing it did not make it easier. The blisters had formed on both palms overnight. They were visible even from Walter's standing distance, as raised, pale patches concentrated at the points of most sustained contact with the iron bars, the centers of her palms, the inside ridges below each finger, the fleshy parts of her thumbs. Agnes's palms were red at the edges, and pale and swollen at the centers, and the blisters were not small. They were the kind you saw on hands that had been in sustained contact with something very cold for a very long time, and they had the look of things that were painful whether you pressed on them or not. Agnes had not mentioned them. Walter had not expected her to. Dorothy and Ruth had noticed them before Walter had. They were positioned closer, and neither of them had said anything either, because there was nothing useful to say, and because Agnes had clearly already noticed them herself, and had decided what to do about them, which was to continue. Frank stood at the outer edge of the crowd, and looked at Agnes's palms, and then at the gate, and then at the flat, unmarked ground beyond it. He was a man who had spent his adult life working with his hands, and he understood, in a visceral and specific way, what sustained damage to the palms felt like, and what it cost. And what he was looking at was something that should have had Agnes lying down with both hands elevated. She was instead pressing those hands flat against iron, with everything she had. He stood looking at this for a long time before he went back to work. The effect of the blisters on the people who noticed them was a particular kind of silence, not the silence of shock, but the silence of confronting visible, physical evidence of something real. People who had come to the gate with general respect and some uncertainty about what exactly was happening found that uncertainty resolve in that moment. Whatever was happening here was happening in a physical and verifiable way, and it was costing the woman in front of them something that could not be faked or misunderstood. The children were marginally better. Nora had checked on Oliver before coming back to the gate that morning and had found him awake and asking, for the first time in 4 days, for something to eat. He had eaten a small amount of porridge and then slept again, but the asking had happened, and Nora was carrying that fact very carefully inside her. May's grandmother Grace had received word by messenger that May had drunk a full cup of water that morning and kept it down. Rose, Mabel's 3-year-old, was still feverish, still holding that distant listening quality in her eyes, still not eating well. But Mabel, who came to check on Rose at home and then walked back to the gate and stood in the crowd, reported that the previous night had been slightly less restless than the one before it. Agnes was aware of the children. She could not have explained how she was aware, given that she could not see them, and no one had spoken to her about them that morning. But she felt the crowd behind her the way you feel the contents of a room you know well even when your back is turned to it. And she had been feeling the children in it since the previous day. And she felt the slight change in their quality this morning, a marginal easing, a fraction of relief. And she pressed harder, because marginal was not enough, and relief was not the same as safe. At around 10 in the morning, a man arrived from the neighboring community. His name was Cecil. He was about 45, broad-shouldered, with the easy confidence of someone who had always been the most capable person in whatever room he walked into, and had arranged his expectations around that fact. He had heard through the informal network that connected small communities in the region that something unusual was happening in Fairholme, and he had come on his motorcycle to see it. He parked on the main path and walked toward the eastern edge of the village, which was where the crowd clearly was, with the manner of someone who expected to be accommodated. Walter intercepted him. The interception happened 30 feet before Cecil could see the gate clearly, which was exactly where Walter had positioned himself 20 minutes earlier, because he had been expecting something like this. A gathering of 60 or more people in a village the size of Fairholme did not stay invisible for long to the communities around it, and Walter had known since the previous afternoon that someone would come to look. He told Cecil, with complete courtesy and perfect calm, that the village was engaged in a religious observance of a private nature. He said that every person present was there freely and of their own will. He said that the community's deepest custom required that this particular observance be conducted without outside observers, and that this was not personal, and that Cecil was very welcome in Fairholme on any other occasion, and was much hoped to visit again. He said all of this in the tone of a man making a kind request, while communicating in every other way, in posture, in the steadiness of his eyes, in the way he had positioned himself so that Cecil could not walk around him without making an obvious point of it, that the kind request had the weight and permanence of a directive. Cecil looked at Walter's face for a moment, and then looked past Walter at the crowd visible on the path, and then looked back at Walter, and seemed to run some internal calculation. Then he turned, walked back to his motorcycle, started it, and left. Walter returned to the gate. The morning wore on. Agnes held. Dorothy and Ruth remained at her sides, not touching unless the trembling in her knees became something that required a response. The trembling was continuous now, visible to those who were close enough to see it. A small, steady vibration in Agnes's legs below the knee, the kind that comes from muscles that have been doing one thing for too long and are expressing this in the only language muscles have. Agnes acknowledged it in the part of her attention she kept for physical monitoring, and continued. A woman named Edith, not Agnes's mother, a different woman, a younger woman, who had moved to Fairholme 12 years ago and had gradually become part of the village's fabric, brought a large pot of porridge to the gathering, in the late morning, and set it up near the outer edge of the crowd, and fed people quietly and without fuss. The way that feeding people quietly is one of the most important things a community does when something serious is happening, and the serious thing does not have an obvious practical task for every pair of hands. Leonard had not stopped praying. He had been praying for close to 30 hours. He sat now, because standing was no longer manageable for his back. But he sat upright, and his lips moved, and his hands were folded, and he was praying. People who passed near him could hear it, a low, continuous sound, not loud enough to make out specific words, just present, just there, the same way the lamp was present at Agnes's feet. At around 2 in the afternoon, the gate pushed 3 times. The first push came without warning, the way the noon push of the previous day had come, but stronger. Stronger from its very beginning, before Agnes could prepare for it, and she felt her feet start to slip on the earth where 30 hours of standing had worn a shallow impression, and she caught herself, and planted her feet more deliberately, and pressed back. First push, strong. She held it. The second came 5 seconds after the first ended. It was stronger than the first push, and it came before her arms had finished recovering from the first one, and it caught her slightly forward of her ideal position, and her left foot slid 1 full inch on the red earth before she stopped it. She found the ground. She held it. The third push came 5 seconds after the second, and it was the strongest thing Agnes had felt from the gate in 31 years of being its keeper. It was not painful in the way that ordinary force is painful. It was something more total than pain, a complete and overwhelming commitment of whatever was pressing, everything it had, brought to bear in a single sustained moment, against a door 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall, and the door was iron, and she was on the other side of it with both palms flat against it, and her feet on the earth, and her body between it and the village. She locked her elbows until she could feel each joint clearly and specifically. She drove her feet into the red earth until the soil came up over the edges of both shoes. She pressed the heel of each hand, and the pad of each finger, and the center of each palm against the iron bars. She leaned in with every pound of her body weight at the angle that gave the most of it to the gate. She held her breath for the last 8 seconds of it, because breathing required the partial relaxation of the muscles she needed fully engaged, and she was not going to give those muscles back. Dorothy and Ruth moved before they had consciously decided to move, simultaneously, both stepping forward, both pressing their shoulders into Agnes's, adding their weight to hers. From further back in the crowd, 3 women stepped forward and placed their hands on Dorothy's and Ruth's backs, a human chain of weight and intention that extended through and past Agnes into the iron. The third push held for what Walter later determined was approximately 30 seconds. In those 30 seconds, no one in the crowd made a sound. The fires that were burning around the perimeter had not been tended since the push began, and one of them went to coals while it was happening. The lamp at Agnes's feet burned steady. The afternoon light was at a particular angle that made the shadows very long and very still. Then the push passed. Agnes exhaled. It was one single long controlled breath going out, and every person who heard it felt something in themselves release at the same time, as if they had been holding their own breath without knowing it. Dorothy and Ruth stepped back a half step. The 3 women behind them released their hands. The crowd breathed. Leonard, who had been sitting about 6 feet to Agnes's left, and had been praying without pause through the push, opened his eyes. He looked at the gate. He covered his face with both hands. His shoulders moved once, a single, deep, uncontrolled movement, before he lowered his hands, folded them again, and returned to his prayer. Agnes's knees were trembling more visibly now than they had been before the push. Dorothy could see the trembling clearly from where she stood, and she watched it carefully, calculating. How long, at this rate, before the knees could no longer be managed by Agnes alone? She did not say this calculation aloud. She stayed where she was, close, ready. The afternoon wore further into itself and then toward evening, and the gate did not push again that day, and Agnes held on in the quiet that followed the great push, the way you hold a door closed in the quiet after a storm, not relaxing, not stepping back, simply staying, because staying is the work, and the work is not finished. Leonard had been watching Agnes's back for 2 days, and he understood now something he had not understood before about endurance, the specific, physical endurance that this kind of sustained effort required. He had thought, before this, that endurance was primarily about the will, that what separated people who held on from people who gave up was the decision to hold on, and that the decision, once made properly and with genuine commitment, would carry you through whatever came after. He had believed this about faith, about ministry, about the long, difficult work of caring for a community over many years, through many varieties of loss and hardship. The will decided, and the body followed. He was revising this. What he saw in Agnes's back over 2 days was something different. The will was there. He had no doubt of this. He had complete certainty of this. But the will was not sufficient by itself. The will required a body capable of carrying it, and the body's capability was being depleted in ways the will could not replace. Agnes's arms were not as stable now as they had been on the first morning. Her legs were not holding her weight as reliably. The blisters on her palms were the visible evidence of something that was also happening invisibly through every part of her that was in sustained contact with the gate. A kind of depletion that went down into the tissue, and that no amount of willpower could fully offset. And yet she held. He had been in ministry for 30 years, and he had seen people die with more grace than most people live, and he had seen people in pain accomplish things that had seemed, on paper, impossible. But he had never seen anything like this, and what it was doing to his theology, his formal, trained, carefully considered theology, was not breaking it, but expanding it, past the edges of any single tradition, into something that felt like the bedrock underneath all traditions, the irreducible thing all of them were reaching toward, when they were reaching toward anything real. He prayed, he kept praying, he did not stop. In the early afternoon, the village woman who had organized the water distribution, the younger woman named Edith, came to Walter with a practical observation. The crowd was now large enough that without some coordination, people were going to start running into each other and creating noise that would be a disturbance. Walter thanked her and asked if she was willing to manage the coordination. She said yes, and went back to the task. And this was how things in Fairholme had always been organized, at the times when organization was most needed, by whoever was present and capable and willing, without ceremony and without a great deal of discussion. The afternoon sun moved in the sky above the village, and the shadows moved with it, and the crowd moved with the shadows, finding the cooler angles. And Agnes did not move, and the gate did not move, and everything that was going to happen was in the process of happening. Ruth had been quiet for most of the second day, the way Ruth was always quiet when things were serious. She was 55 years old and had learned by being alive for 55 years that the people who talked most in a crisis were usually the people who were most frightened of it, and that the appropriate response to a crisis was not talk but presence, and she was good at presence, in the way that some people are good at languages, naturally, without having to think about it, simply by being built that way. She watched Agnes with the same completeness she had been watching her since the first morning, and what she noted in the afternoon of the second day was not the blisters, which she had noted earlier, or the trembling in the knees, which was visible but expected. What she noted was a quality in Agnes's posture that was different from what she had seen on the first day. On the first day, Agnes had been sustaining her position. On the second day, Agnes was not sustaining so much as being. The distinction was subtle but real, the way the difference between a new house and an old house is subtle but real. The new house is holding itself up, and the old house simply is. Agnes had settled into the gate, or the gate had settled into Agnes. Ruth was not sure which way the relationship ran, but she understood that the two things had been in contact long enough to become, in some way, continuous with each other. This made her feel better and worse at the same time. Better because it meant the holding was more efficient, less costly, less subject to the ordinary attritions of effort. Worse because it meant Agnes was in there more deeply than she had been before, and the coming back from deep in would take more out of her than the coming back from the surface. Ruth stayed where she was and watched and kept ready. By the time full dark came on the second night, more than 60 people had gathered in the open ground behind the gate. Nobody had organized this. Nobody had sent for them or called a meeting or announced anything. People had come through the day, and more had come in the late afternoon, and as the sun went down and the lamp at Agnes's feet became the brightest steady light at the eastern edge of the village, more came still. They brought what they had, blankets and food and lamps of their own and, in 2 cases, small wooden chairs, carried from their houses with the domestic practicality that was very particular to Fairholme's way of doing things. Small fires were lit at several points in the space behind the gate. Nothing large, just enough for warmth, and for the particular quality of comfort that fire provides in the dark, when something serious is happening, and the dark would otherwise be too complete. The quality of the second night gathering was different from the first night's vigil. The first night had had the quality of something unexpected being processed in real time, people arriving and finding their positions, and adjusting to what they were seeing. The second night had the quality of a community that had made its decision. The people who were there had chosen to be there, had left their houses and their beds and their evening meals, and come out in the dark to a field at the eastern edge of their village, and sat down and were present. No one needed to explain to anyone else why they were there. The explanation was 60 people gathered in the dark facing the same direction, which was an explanation that required no words. Children who had come in the late afternoon had been taken home and put to bed. The adults had stayed. Nora was there without Oliver, having left him in the care of her eldest daughter, who had reported that Oliver had eaten a full supper and had asked when his mother was coming home. Nora had told her daughter to tell him soon, and had turned and walked back to the gate, because soon was a complex word, and Oliver would be fine, and the gate was not yet finished. Grace was on her stool. Mabel, Rose's mother, had come for the first time to sit in the crowd. She had spent the daylight hours at home with Rose, checking on her constantly, and had come in the evening because Rose had had a moment in the late afternoon of reaching toward her mother with both arms. An intentional and directed reaching that was completely different from the passive endurance of the previous 4 days. Mabel had held her daughter for a long time after that, and then carried her to a neighbor's house and come to the gate, because the moment had told her something, and she needed to be where the something was being decided. Leonard was praying. He had been praying for close to 40 hours by this point, and he was not going to stop. Frank sat in the crowd, without doing any practical work, for the first time since he had arrived. He simply sat and was present, and thought the slow, continuous thoughts of a man who is processing something large. Dorothy and Ruth were at their positions near Agnes. They had not been more than 3 feet from those positions since the morning of the previous day. They would not move from them tonight. Pearl was in the crowd. She was 26 years old and had lived in Fairholme her entire life, and knew Agnes in the way that people know a fixture that has always been where it is, with respect and a certain careful distance, understanding that the gatekeeper was important without needing to know the precise mechanics of the importance. She had come to the gate on the first morning with everyone else. She had stayed through the first day and the first night and the second day, and she had not gone home except once, briefly, to change her cloth and eat something, and she had come back. She had not done the practical work that others had done. She had not organized anything, or provided anything, or comforted anyone. She had simply stood or sat at a position in the crowd about 10 feet behind Agnes, and watched Agnes's back, with an attention that was very quiet and very complete. The kind of attention that does not know it is remarkable, because it does not think of itself as anything other than what the situation requires. She could not have said what she was learning from watching. She only knew that she was not able to stop watching, and that the inability felt right, rather than compulsive, the way certain right actions feel right in the body, before the mind has made its case for them. It was well past midnight when Agnes began to say the names. She had not planned it. She had not thought in that moment, now I will say the names. The first name had come out of her, the way something true comes out when you have been very still for a long time. Not forced, not performed, simply released. She heard her own voice say her mother's name. Edith, said quietly, clearly, with the specific weight of a name spoken to someone you know is listening. Then, Henry. Then, William. She gave each name its full pause before and after, not dramatically, with care, the way you handle something fragile that belongs to someone else and must be treated as their property. Then she said more names. She said the names of people she had known personally in Fairholme's last 3 decades, people she had helped into the world as their midwife, and people she had sat beside as they left it. An elderly man named Percy, who had kept bees for 50 years, and left his hives to his grandson, with a handwritten note, asking that the bees never be rushed. A woman named Vera, who had taught in the village school for 30 years, and had given the same pencil to the same child, who could not afford one every single term, without once making a point of it. A young man named Sidney, who had fallen from a tree at 17, and never recovered. A baby girl named Lily, who had lived 2 days. A farmer named Isaac, who had lost 3 harvests to bad weather, and had kept farming anyway because he could not imagine being anything other than what he was. A grandmother named Beatrice, who had outlived her husband and her children, and had lived to 91, without losing her clarity or her humor. Agnes said their names into the dark air, clearly and quietly, one after another, with the crowd behind her recognizing each name in the way that a small community recognizes its dead, personally, specifically, each name landing differently in each person depending on who was listening. Each name was someone's father or mother or sister or friend, and the crowd received each one with the particular response of people being given back something they had been carrying alone. Nora heard her father's name, and her hand went to her mouth. Grace heard her husband's name, a man dead 13 years, a quiet farmer who had loved her completely and without complication, who had never once gone to sleep without first checking that she was asleep, who had called her by a name he had only for her that no one else knew. She heard his name spoken in Agnes's voice in the dark at the eastern edge of the village, and she did not weep, because she had finished that particular weeping a long time ago, and what came now was something different, something she would have been hard-pressed to name, but that moved through her chest like warmth. An older man near the back of the crowd heard two brothers named aloud, men who had gone before him, and he looked down at the earth between his feet and was completely still. Agnes did not stop. She said name after name, and what Walter noticed with increasing attention as the minutes went on was that she was saying names that she could not have known from her own experience alone. Names of people who had died in Fairholme before Agnes was born. Names from her mother's generation, and her grandmother's generation, and further back than that. Names from the oral tradition, from the lineage of gatekeepers, carried in the body of each keeper, alongside the keeper's words, and the gate's history. Not written anywhere. Held in the accumulated memory of women who had stood at this gate before Agnes, and passed forward, in the same wordless, embodied way, that everything real in the tradition was passed forward. She was not calling to the dead. Walter understood this with full clarity, as he stood in the dark and listened, and he would say it plainly to people who asked him afterward. She was not summoning them, or asking anything of them, or entering into any exchange with them. She was acknowledging them. She was saying, to whatever consciousness had been pressing against the gate for 2 days from the other side, that she knew who was there. She knew every name in that list, every person who had come through Fairholme and passed through this gate in the right direction at the right time. She honored them. She had not forgotten them. She was not closing this gate out of denial, or fear, or ignorance. She was closing it because it was not time. It was not yet time for anyone standing behind her to pass through in the direction they would eventually pass through, and it was not time for what lived on the other side to cross into the world they had left. She was not refusing the dead. She was maintaining the proper order of things, honoring it, insisting on it, with both palms pressed flat against the iron, and her feet in the red earth, and her voice moving through the dark air of a second October night. The names continued for a long time. No one in the crowd counted them. People stopped trying to count them when the list extended past anyone's personal knowledge of the village, and into territory that could only belong to the tradition. What people said afterward, when they tried to describe the experience, was that it felt like being in the presence of something very old that was being spoken out loud for the first time. They said it felt like attending a naming ceremony for the entire history of their community. They said it was the most quiet they had ever heard. 60 people be. Around 3 in the morning, by Walter's watch, Agnes stopped. The silence that followed was one of the most complete silences any of the people present had ever experienced, in a place with 60 people in it. No one moved, no one spoke. The fires had burned to low coals that cast more orange than light. The lamp at Agnes's feet burned steady. The stars above Fairholme were very bright and very clear and very far away. Then Agnes said, quietly and clearly, into the silence, "Not yet." 2 words, not raised in volume, not given any performance or ceremony, just placed into the air, with the same directness she had placed every name, as a statement to something that understood statements. The gate pushed back. It was the hardest single push it had given across the entire time Agnes had been holding it, and it came immediately after the 2 words, as if it had been waiting for them and was now responding. It lasted less than 15 seconds, but in those 15 seconds, the air around the gate changed, in a way that was physical and undeniable, a pressure that people as far as 30 feet back felt in their chests and ears. Several people flinched. One person stepped backward involuntarily. Dorothy and Ruth were already pressing their shoulders into Agnes before they had consciously registered the push. The lamp at Agnes's feet guttered violently in a wind that should not have been there, its flame bending nearly horizontal, before steadying. Agnes pressed back with everything she had, both palms, both forearms, both locked elbows, both feet driven as deep into the earth as they could go. She leaned into the gate with the full commitment of someone who has understood since the beginning that this moment was what everything else had been leading to, and who is meeting it, with everything they have prepared over 31 years to bring to it. She held for 15 seconds. She did not make a sound. Then the cold began, slowly and unmistakably, to ease. Not gone, not over, but withdrawing. The way a wave withdraws from the shore after it has run as far as it can go, not because it was defeated, but because the nature of waves is that they rise, and they reach, and then they return to what they belong to. Agnes felt the cold pulling back through the iron, retreating toward the other side, and she kept pressing forward for another full minute to make certain it was real and not a pause. It was real. The cold continued to ease, slowly and steadily, through the last hour before dawn. Agnes held the gate in the quiet that followed, still pressing, still planted, not trusting the ease entirely, because 31 years had taught her that what comes after the great push is not the end but the beginning of the last stage, the stage where the gate settles into its decision, and where the keeper must remain fully present for the settling to complete. She held, and she waited, and she breathed, and the night held around her, and the village held around the night. Some of the people who heard the names said, afterward, that they had felt as if time was doing something unusual in those minutes. Not stopping, not that. More like becoming permeable, the boundary between now and then becoming less definite, so that the names Agnes was saying were not names from the past but simply names, belonging to people who were at the same distance from this moment as anyone standing in the crowd, just in a different direction. A woman named Josephine, who was 62, and who had lived her whole life in Fairholme, heard her mother's name. Her mother had died when Josephine was 19, in a difficult year when 3 other people in the village had also died, and Josephine had spent the following years carrying her mother's absence in the particular way of someone who is not old enough when a parent dies to have finished being cared for, and must become the carer instead. When she heard her mother's name in Agnes's voice, she sat very still for a long moment, and then placed her hands flat on the earth beside her, palms down, the way you place your hands on ground you want to feel the realness of, and she breathed in a way she had not breathed in 43 years. Walter watched all of this. He watched the crowd, as Agnes said the names, watched the specific responses of specific people, and what he saw confirmed and deepened what he already understood about what was happening. This was not ceremony. This was not performance. This was function. What Agnes was doing had a specific, practical purpose in relation to what was pressing on the other side of the gate, and its practical purpose also happened to give back to every person in that crowd something they had been carrying alone. The two things were not separate. The naming that served the gate also served the people. The care for the dead that the gate required was the same care the living needed to offer their dead, and had not always known how to give. This, Walter thought, is what it means when a tradition is real, when it does not serve only one purpose but many, because the purposes are not separate things but aspects of the same true thing. Agnes said name after name in the dark, and the crowd received them, and the gate received them, and the night deepened around all of it, and none of the fires were tended, and none of the lamps needed tending, and the stars turned slowly overhead, and the village of Fairholme was completely still. On the morning of the 3rd day, Agnes could not stand on her own. This became clear at first light, when Dorothy, who had been watching Agnes's knees continuously through the dark hours, tracking the trembling that had been present since the previous afternoon, saw them buckle for the first time. It was a small buckling, a fraction of an inch downward before Agnes caught herself and held. Then, 8 minutes later, it happened again, and this time the recovery was slower and less complete. Agnes's knees did not give out entirely. She found the ground and held herself, but the effort of finding the ground was visible now, visible to Dorothy and visible to Ruth, and they looked at each other and moved. Dorothy went to Agnes's right side and positioned her shoulder against Agnes's shoulder, and pressed in firmly, adding her weight to Agnes's balance. Ruth did the same on the left. Between them they stabilized Agnes in a way that worked, for now, for this moment, but that Dorothy understood would not be sufficient for very much longer, because the failure was not in Agnes's will, or in her commitment to what she was doing. The failure was in the legs, which had been holding the body of a 63-year-old woman, upright on hard earth, for more than 60 hours, and which had reached the end of what legs can be asked to do without rest. The crowd had swelled again with the morning. People who had gone home to sleep for a few hours had come back with the dawn. People who had not been at the gate at all during the first 2 days had come that morning for the first time, drawn by word of what was happening, and by a feeling that circulated through the village since the night of the second day. A feeling that things were coming toward their conclusion, whatever that conclusion would be, and that the village should be present for it. Pearl was at her usual position about 10 feet behind Agnes. She had been there since before full dark the previous night, and had not gone home. She had slept once, briefly, in the early morning hours before the names began, sitting upright on the ground with her back against another woman's legs, and she had woken to the sound of Agnes's voice in the dark, and had been fully awake since then. She watched Dorothy and Ruth bracing Agnes. She watched Agnes's legs. She watched the quality of Agnes's posture, the way it had changed from the first day, when it had been controlled and deliberate, to this morning, when it was controlled only through immense ongoing effort, when every part of Agnes's body was engaged in the maintenance of a position that the body was trying to leave. Pearl made a decision. She did not think of it as a decision exactly, because it did not feel like a process of deliberation, but like a recognition of what the moment required, and of the fact that she was the person standing in the position to provide it. She stepped forward through the space at the front of the crowd. She crossed the open area behind Agnes without hurrying, without announcing herself, without asking permission. She came to Agnes's back, and she brought both arms around Agnes from behind, her hands meeting in front of Agnes's chest, her own chest pressed firmly against Agnes's back. She did not hold Agnes tightly in the way of someone trying to restrain a person. She held her the way you hold something that needs to continue doing what it is doing, and needs to be supported in order to do it, from behind and below, bearing the weight, letting Agnes's body use hers as a wall to lean against. Agnes felt the arms come around her. She felt the warmth of a body against her back, a young and strong body, positioned exactly where support would matter most. She felt herself held upright, in a way that Dorothy and Ruth's shoulder bracing, valuable as it was, had not been able to provide, because this came from behind and went all the way through her. She said, in a voice that was barely above a breath, "Who are you?" Not a question exactly, or rather, a question that was also a recognition, looking for confirmation. "Pearl," the young woman said. Agnes was quiet. She counted 3 seconds in the way she counted everything in those days, not with a watch, not with words, but with the internal metronome that 31 years of vigil work had given her. Then she said, "Hold here." "I am holding," Pearl said. Something happened in that exchange that both of them felt and neither of them could fully describe afterward. Agnes felt it through Pearl's arms around her, as a quality she recognized from 31 years ago. Recognized not from any direct experience of it at that time, but from her mother's description of it, a description Edith had given her when she was 8 years old, and Agnes had pressed her small hands against the iron for the first time, and asked what that feeling was. Edith had said, "The gate is deciding what to think about you." That was what this felt like. Not in the gate, but in Pearl. The gate's attention, extending backward through Agnes's body, finding the young woman pressed against her back, and deciding. There she is, Agnes thought. The thought was complete and certain, the way a thing is certain when you have been waiting for it long enough, that certainty feels like relief. The 3 children were recovering. Mabel had received word at 8 in the morning that Rose's fever had broken. Rose had woken, looked around her with clear eyes, fully present, fully herself, not listening to anything except the room she was in, and had called for her father, and Arnold had come and picked her up, and Rose had wound her arms around his neck. Mabel had heard this report from her neighbor, and had stood in the middle of the road outside the gate and cried with her hands over her face for a solid minute, before pulling her hands down and straightening herself. Oliver had eaten a full breakfast, and had been told by his sister that he needed to rest, and had argued about it, with the energy of a healthy 7-year-old who is bored, which was the most reassuring thing Nora had heard in 5 days. May had been outside in the yard before anyone had officially woken up, and Grace's neighbor had looked out their window at 7 in the morning, and found May squatting in the yard, examining a beetle with the complete, absorbed attention of a 5-year-old who has not been well, and is now glad to be outside again. Agnes had felt all of this, or something corresponding to it, as it happened. She could not have explained the mechanism. She only knew that the sense she had been carrying for 2 days of 3 small lights burning low and distant suddenly became, in the course of that morning, 3 small lights burning closer and brighter, and each time one came back toward its proper brightness, She felt something ease in the gate, as if two things that had been connected were releasing each other. The third morning passed differently from the first two. The gate was quieter. The cold was still present in the iron under Agnes's palms, still real, still a thing that had to be held against. But its character had changed. From advancing to sustaining, from pushing to simply being present, as if what was on the other side had made its decision, and was not going to push harder, but was also not going to give up entirely. Agnes held it in the way you hold something that has decided to yield gradually, rather than all at once. Patient, steady, not relaxing, not stepping back, simply staying, because staying was the work, and the work was not yet finished. Around 11 in the morning, Leonard rose from where he had been sitting and praying, and walked to Walter's side. His legs were unsteady from sitting for so long, and he steadied himself with one hand on Walter's arm. He said quietly, "I believe it is lessening." Walter said, "I think so too." Leonard said, "She will know before we do." Walter said, "Yes." They stood together and watched Agnes's back, and watched the gate, and waited. The crowd behind them was quiet, in the particular way of people who sense that something is approaching its end, and do not want to do anything that might interfere with the ending. People spoke in low voices when they spoke at all. People who had brought food moved through the crowd distributing it without fuss. The small fires had been allowed to burn out in the morning light, and no one lit new ones. Pearl stood behind Agnes and held her, and watched the back of Agnes's head, and felt, through the contact of their bodies, the sustained effort and the sustained endurance of what Agnes was doing, and felt something else too. The quality she had felt when Agnes had said, "Who are you?" The quality she recognized without being able to name it yet, that had been growing in her since that moment, into something that she understood would take years to fully receive. At 14 minutes and 47 seconds past 2 in the afternoon, Walter checked his watch at the exact moment, out of a habit of precision more than any belief that the time would matter, though it would matter later. When people asked, the pressure stopped. Agnes felt it go. She felt it the way she had felt the easing during the previous night, like a wave going back. But this was not partial easing, this was total. The cold withdrew through the iron completely and quickly, and what replaced it was the warmth of the afternoon air, arriving at her palms after 63 hours of cold, with a startlingness she had not expected. She stood with both palms on the warm iron bars, and checked with her hands, reading the gate the way she had read it on thousands of previous evenings. The gate was quiet, the gate was still, the gate was warm and ordinary, and simply a gate. She lifted her palms from the iron. She stood upright for the first time in 72 hours, without the iron against her hands, with Pearl's arms still around her body, and Dorothy and Ruth still at her sides, and she straightened herself to her full height, as much as she could manage, and looked at the gate from a distance of about 6 inches for a long moment. Then she turned around. She turned slowly, and Pearl's arms released her as she turned, and Dorothy and Ruth stepped back to give her room, and she faced the village of Fairholme, assembled in the afternoon light behind her. They were all there. 60 people, or close to it, tired, most of them, carrying the specific tiredness of people who have been awake for something that mattered. Walter in his chief's cloth, standing straight. Leonard with his hands pressed together. Arthur leaning on his cane with an expression that held too many things to separate. Clara with her hand at her mouth. Nora with her face completely open, undone by something that was not grief, but was its neighbor. Grace, sitting upright on her stool, her rosary clasped in both hands. Mabel with her eyes red from the morning's weeping, and her chin raised. Frank standing at the side with his arms at his sides and his face doing something she had never seen Frank's face do before. Dorothy and Ruth just behind Agnes's shoulders, their own faces carrying the exhaustion and the relief, and the particular look of two women who have been exactly where they needed to be, and know it. Pearl, a step back, her arms that had been around Agnes now at her sides, her face very still and very clear. Agnes looked at all of them. She said nothing. There were no words that were the right words for this moment, and she was not going to speak words that were not right just to fill the silence. The silence was doing what silence does when 60 people have been through something real together. It was holding them, the way good silence holds people when they need to be held and do not yet need to speak. They came to her. George, the young man who had tried to take her arm on the first morning, was the first one to reach her, and he did not reach for her arm. He came and stood close, and was simply present, and waited for her to tell him what she needed. Walter came next. Leonard placed his hand on her shoulder for a moment without speaking. Clara took Agnes's arm very gently, on the left side, and Dorothy came to the right, and between them and Pearl directly behind her, and the rest of the village before and around them, they walked Agnes home. She walked. Her legs moved, and her feet carried her, and she walked. Not well, not steadily, not at her usual pace, but she walked, because she had always walked this path, and she intended to walk it now, and it took 20 minutes to cover the 11-minute distance, and nobody measured the difference. The gate stood behind them as they moved away from it, growing smaller in the perspective of the path, and then disappearing around the bend of the last house, where the village began, closed, latched, quiet, warm in the afternoon light. Everything exactly as it should be. The moment when Agnes lifted her palms from the iron was one that everyone present would later find difficult to describe with precision, because it happened very slowly. The lifting was deliberate and unhurried, the hands coming away from the bars with the care of someone removing their hands from something that has been in contact with them for a very long time, and must be separated with tension and not abruptly. And because the slowness of it gave everyone watching time to understand, in real time, what they were seeing, and what they were seeing was not just a woman removing her hands from a gate, but the end of something that had been happening for 3 days, and the weight of that ended thing was so complete and so specific that the moment of its ending was difficult to hold all at once. Walter, who had been watching continuously for 3 days, found that his eyes had gone blurred without him meaning them to. He did not touch them. He let what was in them be there, because it seemed dishonest not to. Leonard, when the hands came away, closed his eyes for a moment, and his lips moved in a prayer that was not a request but a thank you, which was the prayer his faith had always said was the truest form. Arthur, leaning on his cane at the edge of the crowd, looked at the gate for a long moment after Agnes's hands left it. He was looking at the latch. He was looking at the place where the latch sat, unmoved, unchanged, exactly as it had been for every year he had been in Fairholme, and for every year before that. He thought about Edith's hands after the gate had been held 43 years ago. He thought about the marks on Edith's palms that had stayed until she died. He looked at Agnes's hands, now at her sides, and he thought, "You did it. Both of you. All of you. Every one of them. Back to the beginning." He straightened his back as much as he could, and lifted his chin slightly, not because anyone was watching him, but because the moment seemed to call for it. Nora had been holding her breath without knowing it, and when Agnes turned around, Nora released it in a sound that was not a word, and was not exactly a sob, but was something that her body needed to make, and she made it, and the woman beside her put a hand on her shoulder, and Nora took that hand and held it. Pearl, standing behind where Agnes had been, looked at Agnes's face when Agnes turned, and Agnes's face was the face of someone who has done a hard and necessary thing, and is not asking to be told that it was well done, because she already knows it was done. And knowing it was done is its own complete thing that does not require supplementation from outside. Pearl looked at that face, and she thought, "I will learn what that looks like on my own face." She did not know when. She knew she would. Agnes's hands needed 2 weeks to heal, and in those 2 weeks, the village of Fairholme did what small villages have always done, when one of their own has been through something that cost them everything they had. It gathered around her, and did not leave until she was ready for it to leave. Clara moved from next door into Agnes's house on the first day, not asking permission and not being turned away, bringing a sleeping mat and a change of cloth, and an attitude of complete, practical certainty about the arrangement. She managed the cooking and the cleaning and the garden and the chickens and the steady stream of people who came to Agnes's door in the first days, wanting to see her or speak to her or bring her something. Clara answered the door each time with a kind, absolute firmness that communicated without drama. Agnes was resting. Agnes would receive visitors when she was ready. "Thank you for coming. You may leave what you brought." The exceptions were the people whose visits could not reasonably be deferred. Walter came on the second day. He sat across from Agnes at her small table, with 2 cups of tea between them, and was quiet, for the first 20 minutes, in the way that people who have known each other a long time, and been through something serious together, can be quiet, not uncomfortably, not because there is nothing to say, but because the right things take time to arrive, and silence is not the enemy of arrival. When he finally spoke, he asked 3 questions. He asked what Agnes had heard through the gate in the first hours. He asked what she had felt when she said the names on the second night, and he asked what the release had felt like, the moment the pressure stopped. Agnes answered all three. She told him the sound in the first night was like something very large breathing, and that large in this case meant large in the sense of occupying a vast space, rather than large in the sense of being a creature of unusual size. She said it had not felt threatening in the way that threats feel, aggressive, directed, but the way a very large river feels when you are standing at its edge and know you are not a swimmer. She told him the names had come from the tradition, from the lineage, from the accumulated memory of 6 gatekeepers over 6 generations, and that they had been exactly the right thing, because the gate needed to know she was not denying the dead or pretending they were not there. She was telling them she knew they existed and honored them and was not refusing them, only maintaining the boundary at the proper time. And she told him the release had felt like a wave going all the way back, not pausing and not retreating partially, but genuinely withdrawing, and that when it was gone, the iron under her hands had become simply iron again, warm and ordinary and inert, the same iron she had pressed her hands against thousands of times before. Walter listened to all of this without interrupting, the way he listened to everything, as if what was being said to him was the most important thing being said anywhere in the world at that moment, which was one of the qualities that had made him a good chief for 22 years. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The children." "Yes," Agnes said. "Did you understand the connection?" Agnes said she believed the children had been drawn by the gate's activity in the same way the animals had been repelled by it. Animals moved away from sources of powerful, unusual energy. Young children, whose relationship to what surrounded them had not yet been filtered through the years of selective attention that adults develop, were sometimes drawn toward such sources instead of away from them. The gate's pressing outward had reached the children who were nearest to it in the village, and their bodies, which could not hold that kind of attention without consequence, had responded with fever and distance. She said she was not certain of this. She would carry it forward in the teaching and continue to think about it, and perhaps Pearl, in her own time, would come to understand it better than Agnes had. Walter said, "Pearl." Agnes said, "Yes." Walter was quiet again for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you known?" Agnes thought about this carefully. She said she had first felt the quality of recognition on the 3rd morning, when Pearl had come around her from behind. But she said she thought it had been there before that, perhaps for some time, and she had simply not been in the right position to feel it. "Some things," she said, "you can only perceive from certain angles." Walter nodded slowly. He finished his tea. He stood to leave, and at the door he turned back, and he said simply, "You held it." He said it the way someone states a fact they have been turning over in their mind, long enough to know it is a fact and not an opinion. Agnes said, "Yes." Arthur came on the 3rd day with the ointment. He made it himself, from a recipe that lived entirely in his head, and that he had learned from his own mother, who had learned it from hers, and which had been designed, so the story went, for exactly the kind of injury that sustained contact with something very cold, over a very long period produced in human skin. He sat across from Agnes and uncovered her hands and applied the ointment carefully, using 2 fingers and moving in slow, deliberate strokes that covered every part of the damaged surface without pressing hard enough to cause pain. His hands were large and old and patient. He said, while he worked, "I told your mother afterward, after she held the gate 43 years ago, that what she had done was the most significant thing I had witnessed in my life. I had not expected to say something similar again." He looked up at her briefly. "I am saying it again." Agnes looked at him steadily. "You are kind," she said. "I am accurate," he said. He finished the ointment and wrapped her hands in clean cloth and sat back. 10 days, and the new skin will close. It will be tight. It will scar. But it will work. He was right. Within 2 days of using his preparation, the raw surfaces had begun to close. Agnes watched the healing with the same practical attention she would have given to anyone's healing, noting the progress and the changes in sensation as the new tissue formed and the deep ache in her palms gradually found a new register. Leonard came on the 5th day. He sat across from Agnes with his hands folded on the table and looked at her with the serious, direct attention of a man of faith who has had his faith confirmed in a way he had not quite expected and is still in the early stages of understanding what to do with that. He did not try to make what had happened fit into a framework he already had. He was a man who had learned, over 26 years in Fairholme, that the frameworks needed to be large enough for the truth and not the other way around. He said, I heard the names. I heard people I had buried. He paused. I heard people I had known. Agnes nodded. He said, Is there anything in the tradition that explains what that was, what the names were for? Agnes said, The gatekeeper speaks every name, so that the dead are not forgotten while the gate is being held closed against them. They are not being refused, they are being honored. There is a difference between refusing and maintaining a boundary, and the gate understands the difference, and what you say to it in those hours needs to make the difference clear. Leonard sat with this for a moment. In my tradition, he said, we believe the care of souls does not end at death, that what was once a person continues to exist and to matter, and that the living have a responsibility to the dead as well as to each other. Yes, Agnes said. What you did, he said carefully, seems to me to be exactly that, the care of souls. Agnes looked at him and said, I think you will find that most of what is genuinely true points in the same direction, regardless of where you start from. Leonard was quiet for a moment, then he said, Yes, I find that too, more and more. He prayed before he left, a quiet prayer that asked for nothing specific except grace, which in Agnes's experience was all the good prayers ever asked for. She sent for Pearl on the 10th day. She had considered for several days how to begin, and she had decided not to consider it further, because her mother had not considered how to begin with Agnes. Edith had simply brought 8-year-old hands to the iron and said, Do you feel that? The beginning was in the doing, not in the planning of it. Pearl came to Agnes's house on a Tuesday afternoon and sat across from her at the table and did not ask anything. She sat with her hands in her lap and waited, which told Agnes what she needed to know about Pearl's readiness, because only someone who understood that waiting was already the teaching could have waited in quite that way. Agnes said, You held me up. Pearl said, Yes. Agnes said, Why did you step forward? Pearl considered this honestly, and when she answered, she said, Because you needed holding, and because I was in the position to hold you, and because the thing you were doing was the most important thing happening anywhere in the world at that moment, and I was there. Agnes turned her hands over on the table and showed Pearl her palms, the new skin, pink and tight and slightly shiny, the scarring already taking on its permanent form. Pearl looked at them without flinching and without looking away. She looked at them the way you look at something that tells you something true, and that you understand you are going to spend a long time understanding. Do you know what this is? Agnes said. I am beginning to understand, Pearl said. Good, Agnes said. That is where we start. The 3 children were fully recovered within 7 days of Agnes coming home. Oliver was back at school, arguing with his friends about minor things, with the energy of a healthy 7-year-old who has not been arguing with anyone for almost a week and has a backlog of opinions. May was playing in the yard again in the afternoon, the particular running and stopping and running play of a 5-year-old with a good imagination and nothing specifically to do. Rose was running through her house with the joyful, purposeless momentum that 3-year-olds run with, no destination and no need for one, and Mabel stood in the doorway watching her daughter run, and felt a gratitude so large it had no rim. The village of Fairholme changed after the 3 days at the gate. Not in ways that were obvious to anyone passing through, not in ways that required announcement or ceremony. What changed was quieter than that, and more permanent. The texture of how certain things were held and spoken about, how much space people allowed in their understanding of the world for what they could not fully explain. People who had been inclined towards skepticism found that their skepticism now sat more carefully, with a greater awareness of its own limits. People who had always believed found that their belief was now grounded in something witnessed and shared rather than held privately against the possibility of doubt. Frank, who had been the most committed practical skeptic before the 3 days, became in the months that followed one of the people in Fairholme who spoke about the gate with the greatest quiet authority. He did not dramatize what he had experienced. He did not tell the story loudly or at every occasion, but when people came to him who were struggling to understand what had happened, people who had not been at the gate and who were trying to decide whether what they had heard from others was really what the others thought it was, Frank said, simply and plainly, Yes, it was. I was there. I felt the air change. I saw her hands. That is not something you explain away. He said this in the tone of a practical man making a statement of observed fact. which was the tone that carried most weight with the people who needed to hear it. Agnes resumed her evening walks to the gate on the 15th day after she came home. She walked slowly, keeping her hands loose at her sides, and when she reached the gate, she pressed her palms flat against the iron, and felt what she always felt in ordinary times. The gate warm and still and quietly attentive, the ordinary vigil quality of it, the sense of something that knew she was there, and was satisfied by that knowledge. She stood at the gate for a long time on that first return visit, not because there was anything to monitor or anything that required her to stay, simply because it was good to stand there. She began walking to the gate in the mornings as well. She had done it only in the evenings before. After the 3 days, she found she wanted the mornings too. She went at dawn, when the village was barely awake, and the light was golden and low, and the path was cool under her feet, and she pressed her hands against the iron, and stood in the quiet, and then came home, and made tea, and watched the day begin through her window. She did this every morning for the rest of her life. Pearl's training continued through the next 6 years, in the same fragmented, gradual, experiential way that Edith had trained Agnes. Not in formal sessions, but in the accumulation of time, in walks to the gate at dawn and at evening, in standing together at the iron and learning what the hands reported. Agnes told Pearl everything she had. She found, in the process of teaching, pieces of knowledge she had not known she retained, things her mother had told her once, briefly, in passing, years ago, that had lived in her body without her conscious awareness, until the act of teaching brought them forward. The tradition was more intact inside her than she had believed. The 3 days at the gate had not depleted it, but organized it, the way a great storm sometimes clears the air. Pearl was a fast learner in the way that people with the right orientation always learn this thing quickly, not through effort or study, but through a responsiveness to what the gate told her that was immediate and clear. The gate knew Pearl. It had known her since the 3rd morning. It gave her legible information, and she knew how to receive it. Agnes died on a Monday morning in April, in the 74th year of her life. She had been declining for 8 months, nothing acute or dramatic, simply the slow, organized process of a body that has done its work and is beginning to let the work go. Pearl had been coming every day for the final several weeks, and on the Sunday before, they had sat together at Agnes's table until late in the evening, talking not about the gate or the tradition, or anything that required the formality of teaching, but about the village and the people in it, and the specific texture of a life spent in one place over a long time. Agnes had been in good spirits. She had laughed several times at things Pearl said. She had eaten well. She had sent Pearl home at 10 o'clock saying she was tired and wanted to sleep. When Pearl came back in the morning, she found Agnes exactly as she had been lying when Pearl left, on her mat, her hands at her sides, her face completely peaceful. The lines were all there, the lines of 63 years of outdoor work and practical life and sustained, difficult effort, but they were settled now, in a way they had not always been settled, as if everything they had held in tension during her life had been released at the same time, and what remained was the face of someone who had put down something she had been carrying for a very long time, and found the putting down to be exactly what she had always expected. Pearl sat with her for a long time before she went to tell anyone. She sat in the morning light of Agnes's house with the woman who had changed the entire direction of her understanding of her own life, and she was present with her, and that was what the moment required, and she gave it fully. That evening, Pearl made her first walk to the gate as the sole gatekeeper. She walked the path alone in just over 11 minutes, in dry season pace, wearing her own shoes on the red dirt that the 6 gatekeepers before her had worn smooth over generations of the same walk. She reached the gate at the time when the sky was going from orange to the first purple and the earliest stars were beginning to appear. She placed both palms flat against the iron. The gate was warm, still, alive with the attention she had come to know over 6 years of training, that particular quality of something real paying close and deciding attention, something that knew who she was and understood that she was the one it now answered to. She had felt this quality for the first time on the 3rd morning, through the contact of Agnes's body pressed against hers, transmitted through Agnes the way warmth is transmitted through contact. She recognized it now directly, through her own palms, for the first time alone. The gate knew her. It had known her for 6 years. She was, now, the one it answered to. She stood at the gate in the last light of the evening, and the gate told her what it always told Agnes in ordinary times. that the boundary was intact, that the proper side of things was being kept on its proper side, that the keeper was here, and that this was enough. She held her palms against the iron for a long moment after she had received this, because Agnes had always held for a long moment after receiving this, and Pearl understood now why, not from any specific explanation Agnes had given, but from the understanding she had built over 6 years of standing beside someone who knew. You stayed a moment longer than you needed to, because the gate knew you were watching, and attention was its own kind of care. You stayed a moment longer because the staying said what words could not say. I am here. I know what this is. I will not leave until it is time to leave, and then I will come back. She removed her palms from the iron. She walked home along the red dirt path in the growing dark, and behind her, the gate stood in the evening, exactly as it had always stood, closed, latched, quiet, its iron warm from the day's sun. The village of Fairholme made its ordinary sounds around her as she walked. Children being called in, wood smoke rising from the cooking fires, a radio playing somewhere, a song carried on the air above the rooftops, a dog bark and its silence. The sounds of a village that was safe. The gate was closed. It would stay closed.